The Kingdom of God is Within You, by Leo Tolstoy. Part 3, Chapter 7. The cultured people of the higher classes try to drown the consciousness of the necessity of changing the present order of things, which is becoming all the time clearer and clearer, but life, continuing to develop and to become more complex in the former direction and intensifying the contradictions and sufferings of men, brings them to that last limit, beyond which it is impossible to go. Such a last limit, beyond which it is impossible to go, is the universal military service. People generally think that universal military service and the ever-increased arming, which is connected with it, and the consequent increase of taxation and of state debts among all the nations are an accidental phenomenon, due to some political condition of Europe, and may also be removed by some political considerations without an internal change of life. This is quite erroneous. Universal military service is nothing but an inner contradiction which, having been carried to its utmost limits and having at a certain stage of material development become obvious, has stolen its way into the social concept of life. The social concept of life consists in this very fact, that the meaning of life is transferred from the individual to the aggregate, and its consequence is transferred to the tribe, the family, the race, or the state. From the social concept of life, it follows that, insofar as the meaning of life is contained in the aggregate of individuals, the individuals themselves voluntarily sacrifice their interests for the interests of the aggregate. Thus it has always been in reality in the case of certain forms of the aggregate, in the family or the tribe, independently of which preceded, or in the race, or even in the patriarchal state. In consequence of the habit, which is transmitted by education and confirmed by religious influences, the individuals have without compulsion blended their interests with the interests of the aggregate and have sacrificed their own interests for the common interest. But the more societies became complex, the greater they grew, especially the more frequently conquests were the causes why men united into societies. The more frequently did individuals strive after attaining their ends to the disadvantage of the common good, and the more frequently was there felt the need of the exercise of power, that is, of violence, for the sake of curbing these unsubmissive individuals. The defenders of the social concept of life generally try to mix up the concept of power, that is, of violence, with that of spiritual influence, but this admixture is quite impossible. A spiritual influence is an action upon a man, such that in consequence of it the very desires of a man are changed and coincide with what is demanded of him. A man who submits to a spiritual influence acts in accordance with his desires. But power, as this word is generally understood, is a means for compelling a man to act contrary to his wishes. A man who submits to power does not act as he would wish, but as the power compels him to act. Now what can compel a man to do, not what he wishes, but what he does not wish, is physical violence or a threat of using such, that is, the deprivation of liberty, beating, maiming, or executable menaces that such actions will be carried out. In this has power always consisted. In spite of the unceasing efforts made by men in power to conceal this and to ascribe a different meaning to power, power is the application of a rope, a chain, by which a man will be bound and dragged along, or of a whip with which he will be flogged, or of a knife, an axe with which they will cut off his hands, feet, ears, head, an application of these means, or a threat that they will be used. Thus it was in the time of Nero and of Genghis Khan, and thus it is even now, in the most liberal of governments, in the Republic of America and in that of France. If men submit to power, they do so only because they are afraid that in case they do not submit, these actions will be applied to them. All governmental demands, the payment of taxes, the execution of public works, the submission to punishments imposed upon one, exile, penalties, and so forth, to which men seem voluntarily to submit, have always had bodily violence, or a threat that such will be used, for their base. The basis of power is bodily violence. The possibility of exerting bodily violence against people is first of all given by an organization of armed men in which all the armed men act in agreement, submitting to one will. Such assemblies of armed men, who submit to one will, are formed by the army. The army has always stood at the base of power. Power is always found in the hands of those who command an army, and all potentates, from the Roman Caesars to the Russian and German emperors, are more than anything else concerned about the army, knowing that if the army is with them, the power will remain in their hands. It is this formation and increase of the army, which is necessary for the support of power, that has introduced a decomposing principle into the social concept of life. The end of power and its justification consists in the limitation of those men who might wish to attain their interests to the disadvantage of the interests of the aggregate. But whether the power has been acquired by the formation of a new power, by inheritance, or by election, men who possess power by means of an army have in no way differed from other men, and so have, like other men, been prone not to subordinate their interests to those of the aggregate, but, on the contrary, having in their hands the possibility of doing so, have been more prone than anyone else to subordinate the common interests to their own. No matter how much men have devised means for depriving men in power of the possibility of subordinating the common interests to their own, or for entrusting the power only into the hands of infallible men, there have so far been discovered no means for doing either. All methods employed, either of divine sanction, or of election, or of heredity, or of suffrage, or of assemblies, or of parliaments, or of senates, have proved ineffective. All men know that not one of these methods attains the aim of entrusting the power into none but infallible hands, or of preventing its being misused. All know that, on the contrary, men in power, be they emperors, ministers, chiefs of police, policemen, become, by the very fact of having power, more prone to commit immoralities, that is, to subordinate the common interests to their own, than men who have no power, as indeed it could not be otherwise. The social concept of life justified itself only so long as all men voluntarily sacrificed their interests to the common interests, but the moment there appeared men who did not voluntarily sacrifice their interests and power was needed, that is, violence, for the purpose of limiting these individuals, the decomposing principle of power, that is, violence exerted by one set of people against another, entered into the social concept of life and the structure which is based upon it. For the power of one set of men over another to attain its end of limiting men who strove after their individual interests to the disadvantage of those of the aggregate, it was necessary to have the power vested in the hands of infallible men, as is assumed to be the case by the Chinese, and as has been assumed in the Middle Ages and at the present time by men who believe in the sanctity of anointment. It was only under this condition that the social structure received its justification. But since this does not exist, and men in power, on the contrary, by the very fact of their possession of power, are never saintly, the social structure, which is based on power, should not have any justification. Even if there was a time when, with a certain low level of morality and with the universal tendency of men to exert violence against each other, the existence of the power which limited this violence was advantageous, that is, when the violence of the state was not so great as that exerted by individuals against each other, it is impossible to overlook the fact that such a superiority of the state over its absence could not be permanent. The more the tendency of individuals to exert violence was diminished, the more the manners were softened, and the more the power was corrupted in consequence of its unrestraint, the more did this superiority grow less and less. In this change of the relation between the moral development of the masses and the corruption of the governments does the whole history of the last 2,000 years consist. In the simplest form, the case was like this. Men lived by tribes, families, races, and waged war, committed acts of violence, and destroyed and killed one another. These cases of violence took place on a small and on a large scale. Individual struggled with individual, tribe with tribe, family with family, race with race, nation with nation. Larger, more powerful aggregates conquered the weaker, and the larger and the more powerful the aggregate of people became, the less internal violence took place in it, and the more secure did the continuance of the life of the aggregate seem to be. The members of the tribe or of the family, uniting into one aggregate, war less among themselves, and the tribe and the family do not die, like one man, but continue their existence, between the members of one state, who are subject to one power. The struggle seems even weaker, and the life of the state seems even more secure. These unions into greater and ever greater aggregates did not take place because men consciously recognized such unions as more advantageous to themselves, as is described in the story about the calling of the Varangians, but in consequence, on the one hand, of natural growth, and on the other, of struggle and conquests. When the conquest is accomplished, the power of the conqueror actually puts an end to internecine strife, and the social concept of life receives its justification. But this confirmation is only temporary. Internal strife cease only in proportion as the pressure of the power is exerted upon individuals who heretofore have been warring against one another. The violence of internal struggle, which is destroyed by the power, is conceived in the power itself. The power is in the hands of just such people as all men are, that is, of such as are always or frequently prepared to sacrifice the common good for the sake of their personal good, with this one difference, that these men do not have the tempering force of the counteraction of the violated, and are subjected to the full corrupting influence of power. Thus the evil of violence, passing over into the hands of power, keeps growing more and more, and in time comes to be greater than the one which it is supposed to destroy, whereas in the members of society the proneness to violence keeps weakening more and more, and the violence of power grows less and less necessary. The governmental power, even if it destroys inner violence, invariably introduces new forms of violence into the lives of men, and this grows greater and greater in proportion with its continuance and intensification. Thus, although the violence is less perceptible in the state than the violence of the members of society against one another, since it is not expressed by struggle, but by submission, the violence none the less exists, and for the most part in a much more powerful degree than before. This cannot be otherwise, because the possession of power not only corrupts men, but the purpose or even unconscious tendency of the violators will consist in bringing the violated to the greatest degree of weakening, since the weaker the violated man is, the less effort will it take to suppress him. For this reason, the violence which is exerted against him who is violated keeps growing to the farthest limit which it can attain without killing the hen that is laying the golden eggs. But if this hen does not lay, as in the case of the American Indians, the Fijians, the Negroes, it is killed, in spite of the sincere protestations of the philanthropists against such a mode of action. The best confirmation of this is found in the condition of the laboring classes of our time, who in reality are nothing but subjugated people. In spite of all the hypocritical endeavors of the higher classes to alleviate the condition of the working people, all the working people of our world are subject to an invariable iron law, according to which they have only as much as they need to be always incited by necessity to work and to have the strength for working for their masters, that is, for the conquerors. Thus it has always been. In proportion with the duration and increase of power, its advantages have always been lost for those who subjected themselves to it, and its disadvantages have been increased. Thus it has been independently of those forms of government under which the nations have lived. The only difference is this, that in a despotic form of government the power is concentrated in a small number of violators, and the form of the violence is more pronounced. In the constitutional monarchies and republics, as in France and in America, the power is distributed among a larger number of violators, and its forms are less pronounced. But the matter of violence, with which the disadvantages of the power are greater than its advantages, and its process, which brings the violated to the extreme limit of weakening to which they can be brought for the advantage of the violators, are always one and the same. Such has been the condition of all the violated, but before this they did not know it, and in the majority of cases they believed naively that governments existed for their good, that without government they would perish, that the thought that men could live without governments was a blasphemy which ought not even be uttered, that this was for some reason a terrible doctrine of anarchism, with which is connected the conception of everything terrible. Men believed, as in something absolutely proved, and so needing no further proofs, that, since until now all the nations have developed in a governmental form, this form was forever an indispensable condition of the development of humanity. Thus it went on for hundreds and for thousands of years, and the governments, that is, men in power, have tried, and now try more and more, to keep the nations in this error. Thus it was in the time of the Roman emperors, and thus it is at present. In spite of the fact that the idea of the uselessness and even harm of the governmental violence more and more enters into the consciousness of men, this would last forever. If the governments were not obliged to increase the armies for the purpose of maintaining their power. People generally think that the armies are increased by the governments for the purpose of defending the states against other states, forgetting the fact that armies are needed by the governments for the purpose of protecting themselves against their own crushed and enslaved subjects. This has always been indispensable and has become more and more necessary in proportion as culture has been developed among the nations, in proportion as the intercourse among the men of the same and of different nations has been increased. And it has become particularly indispensable now in connection with the communistic, socialistic, anarchistic, and universal movements among the laboring classes. The governments feel this and so increase their main force of the disciplined army. Point 25. Answering lately to a question why money was needed for the increase of the wages of underofficers, the German Chancellor declared frankly in the German Reichstag that there was a need of reliable underofficers in order to fight against socialism. Caprivi only said in the hearing of all what everybody knows, though it is carefully concealed from the nations. He explained why guards of Swiss and Scotch men were hired out to French kings and popes, and why in Russia they carefully shuffle up the recruits in such a way that the regiments which are located in the center are made up of recruits from the outlying districts, while the regiments in the outlying districts are completed by soldiers from the center of Russia. The meaning of Caprivi's speech, translated into simple language, is this: that money was not needed for counteracting the foreign enemies, but for bribing the underofficers, so as to make them willing to act against the oppressed laboring masses. Caprivi accidentally gave utterance to what everybody knows, or feels, if he does not know, namely, that the existing structure of life is such as it is, not because it naturally must be such, because the nation wants it to be such, but because it is maintained as such by the violence of the governments, by the army with its bribed underofficers, officers, and generals. If a laboring man has no land, no chance of making use of the right, so natural for every man, to obtain from the land his own means of support and those of his family, this is not so because the nation wants it to be so, but because certain men, the owners of land, are granted the right to admit, or not to admit, the laboring people to it. And this unnatural order of things is maintained by means of the army. If the immense wealth accumulated by the laboring people is not considered as belonging to all men, but to an exclusive number of men, if the power to collect taxes from labor and to use the money for anything they may see fit is entrusted to a few men, if a few men are permitted to select the method of the religious and civil instruction and education of the children, if strikes of the laborers are opposed and strikes of the capitalists are encouraged, if a few men are granted the right to compose laws which all must obey and to dispose of men's property and life, all this does not take place because the nation wants it so, but because the governments and the ruling classes want it so, and by means of bodily violence establish it so. Every person who does not know this will find it out in every attempt at not conforming or at changing this order of things. Therefore, armies are first of all indispensable to the governments and the ruling classes in order to maintain the order of things which not only does not result from the necessity of the nation, but is frequently opposed to it and is advantageous only to the government and to the ruling classes. Every government needs armies, first of all, in order to keep its subjects in submission and to exploit their labors. But the government is not alone. Side by side with it there is another government, which exploits its subjects by means of the same violence, and which is always ready to take away from another government the labors of its already enslaved subjects. And so every government needs an army, not only for internal use, but also for the protection of its booty against neighboring ravishers. Every government is in consequence of this involuntarily led to the necessity of increasing its army in emulation with the other governments, but the increasing of armies is contagious, as Montesquieu remarked 150 years ago. Every increase of an army in a state, directed against its subjects, becomes dangerous even for its neighbors and evokes an increase in the neighboring states. The armies have reached their present millions not merely because the neighbors threatened the states. This resulted above all from the necessity of crushing all attempts at revolt on the part of the subjects. The increase of armies arises simultaneously from two causes which provoke one another. Armies are needed against domestic enemies and for the purpose of defending one's position against one's neighbors. One conditions the other. The despotism of a government always increases with the increase and strengthening of armies and external successes, and the aggressiveness of governments is increased with the intensification of the internal despotism. In consequence of this, the European governments, in emulating one another in the greater and ever greater increase of the army, arrived at the inevitable necessity of the universal military service. Since the universal military service was a means for obtaining in time of war the greatest quantity of soldiers at the least expense. Germany was the first to hit upon this plan, and the moment one government did it, all the others were obliged to do the same. The moment this happened, it happened that all the citizens were put under arms for the purpose of maintaining all that injustice which was committed against them. What happened was that all the citizens became oppressors of themselves. The universal military service was an inevitable logical necessity, at which it was impossible not to arrive. At the same time, it is the last expression of the inner contradiction of the social concept of life, which arose at a time when violence was needed in order to maintain it. In the universal military service, this contradiction became obvious. Indeed, the meaning of the social concept of life consists in this, that a man, recognizing the cruelty of the struggle of individuals among themselves and the perishableness of the individual himself, transfers the meaning of his life to the aggregate of individuals. But in the universal military service, it turns out that men, having brought all the sacrifices demanded of them, in order to free themselves from the cruelty of the struggle and the insecurity of life, are, after all the sacrifices which they have made, again called to bear all those dangers from which they thought they had freed themselves, and, besides, that aggregate, the state, in the name of which the individuals renounced their advantages, is again subjected to the same danger of destruction to which the individual himself was subjected before. The governments were to have freed men from the cruelty of the struggle of individuals and to have given them the assurance of the inviolability of the order of the state life, but instead, they impose upon the individuals the necessity of the same struggle, except that the struggle with the nearest individuals is transferred to the struggle with the individuals of other states, and they leave the same danger of the destruction of the individual and of the state. The establishment of the universal military service is like what would happen if a man were to brace up a dilapidated house. The walls bend inwards, supports are put up. The ceiling is sagging down, other supports are put up. Boards hang down between the supports, some more supports are put up. A point is finally reached when the supports indeed hold the house together, but it is impossible to live in the house because there are so many supports. The same is true of the universal military service. It destroys all those advantages of the social life which it is called to preserve. The advantages of the social life consist in the security of property and labor and in the cooperation in the aggregate perfection of life. The universal military service destroys all that. The taxes which are collected from the masses for war preparations swallow the greater share of the production of labor which the army is supposed to protect. The tearing away of the men from the habitual course of life impairs the possibility of the work itself. The menaces of a war that is likely to break out at any time make all the perfections of the social life useless and in vain. If a man was formerly told that if he did not submit to the power of the state, he would be subjected to the attacks of evil men, of external and internal enemies, that he would be compelled himself to struggle with them and to subject himself to being killed, that therefore it would be advantageous for him to bear certain privations in order to free himself from these calamities, he was able to believe it all, because the sacrifices which he made for the state were only private sacrifices and gave him the hope for a peaceful life in an imperishable state, in the name of which he made these sacrifices. But now, when these sacrifices have not only increased tenfold, but the advantages promised to him are absent, it is natural for anyone to imagine that his submission to power is quite useless. But not in this alone lies the fatal significance of the universal military service, as a manifestation of that contradiction which is contained in the social concept of life. The main manifestation of this contradiction consists in the fact that with the universal military service, every citizen, upon becoming a soldier, becomes a supporter of the state structure, and a participant in everything which the government does and the legality of which he does not recognize. The governments assert that the armies are needed mainly for the purpose of external defense, but that is not true. They are needed first of all against their subjects, and every man who does military service involuntarily becomes a participant in all the violence which the state exerts over its own subjects. To convince himself that every man who does his military service becomes a participant in such deeds of the government as he does not acknowledge and cannot acknowledge, let a man only remember what is being done in every state in the name of order and of the good of the nation, things which the army appears as the executor of. All the struggles of dynasties and of the various parties, all the executions which are connected with these disturbances, all the suppressions of revolts, all the employment of military force for the dispersion of popular crowds, the suppression of strikes, all the extortions of taxes, all the injustice of the distribution of the ownership of land, all the oppressions of labor, all this is produced, if not directly by the armies, at least by the police, which is supported by the armies. He who does military service becomes a participant in all these matters, which in some cases are doubtful to him and in many cases are directly opposed to his conscience. Some people do not wish to leave the land which they have been working for generations. People do not wish to disperse, as they are commanded to do by the government. People do not want to pay the taxes which are exacted of them. People do not wish to recognize the obligatoriness for them of laws which they have not made. People do not wish to be deprived of their nationality, and I, by doing military service, am obliged to come and beat these people. Being a participant in these deeds, I cannot help but ask myself whether these deeds are good and whether I ought to contribute to their execution. Universal military service is for the government the last degree of violence, which is necessary for the support of the whole structure, and for the subjects it is the extreme limit of the possibility of their obedience. It is that keystone which holds the walls and the extraction of which causes the building to cave in. The time came when the growing abuses of the governments and their strifes among themselves had this effect, that from every subject there were demanded, not only material, but also moral sacrifices, when every man had to stop and ask himself, "Can I make these sacrifices? And in the name of what must I make these sacrifices?" These sacrifices are demanded in the name of the state. In the name of the state, they demand of me the renunciation of everything which may be dear to man, of peace, of family, of security, of human dignity. What is that state in the name of which such terrible sacrifices are demanded of me? And why is it so indispensably necessary? The state, we are told, is indispensably necessary in the first place, because without the state, I and all of us would not be protected against violence and the attack of evil men. In the second place, without the state, all of us would be savages, and would have no religious, nor educational, nor mercantile institutions, nor roads of communication, nor any other public establishments, and, in the third place, because without the state we should be subject to enslavement by neighboring nations. Without the state, we are told, we should be subject to violence and to the attacks of evil men in our own country. But who among us are these evil men, from the violence and attacks of whom the state and its army save us? If 4 centuries ago, when men boasted of their military art and their accoutrements, when it was considered a virtue to kill men, there existed such men, there are none now, for no men of the present time use or carry weapons, and all, professing the rules of philanthropy and of compassion for their neighbors, wish the same as we, the possibility of a calm and peaceful life. There now are no longer those particular violators against whom the state should defend us. But if, by the people, from whose attack the state saves us, we are to understand those men who commit crimes, we know that they are not some special beings, like rapacious animals among the sheep, but just such people as we are, who are just as disinclined to commit crimes as those against whom they commit them. We know now that threats and punishments cannot diminish the number of such men, and that it is only the change of surroundings and the moral influence upon people that diminish it. Thus, the explanation of the necessity of governmental violence for the purpose of defending men against violators may have had a basis 3 or 4 centuries ago, but has none at the present time. Now the contrary would be more correct, namely, that the activity of the governments, with their morality which has fallen behind the common level, with their cruel methods of punishments, of prisons, of hard labor, of gallows, of guillotines, rather contributes to the brutalization of the masses than to the softening of their manners, and so rather to the increase than to the diminution of the number of violators. Without the state, they also say, there would not be all those institutions of education, of learning, of religion, of roads of communication, and others. Without the state, men would not be able to establish the public things which are indispensable for all men. But this argument, too, could have a basis only several centuries ago. If there was a time when men were so disunited among themselves, and the means for a closer union and for the transmission of thought were so little worked out that they could not come to any understanding nor agree upon any common mercantile or economical or cultural matter without the medium of the state, there now no longer exists such a disunion. The widely developed means for communion and for the transmission of thought have had this effect, that for the formation of societies, assemblies, corporations, congresses, learned, economic, or political institutions, the men of our time can get along without any government, and the governments in the majority of cases are more likely to interfere with the attainment of these ends than to cooperate with it. Beginning with the end of the last century, almost every forward step of humanity has not only not been encouraged by the government, but has always been retarded by it. Thus it was with the abolition of corporal punishment, of torture, of slavery, and with the establishment of the freedom of the press and of assemblies. In our time, the power of the state and the governments not only fail to cooperate with, but are distinctly opposed to, all that activity by means of which men work out new forms of life. The solutions of laboring, agronomic, political, religious questions are not only not encouraged, but directly interfered with by the power of the state. Without the state and the government, the nations would be enslaved by their neighbors. It is hardly necessary to retort to this last argument. The retort is found in itself. The governments, so we are told, are necessary with their armies for the purpose of defending us against our neighbors, who might enslave us. But this is what all the governments say of one another, and at the same time we know that all the European nations profess the same principles of freedom and of brotherhood, and so are in no need of defending themselves against one another. But if protection against barbarians is meant, then 1,000th of all the armies now under arms would suffice. Thus, the contrary to what is asserted is what actually happens. The power of the state, far from saving us from the attacks of our neighbors, on the contrary causes the danger of the attacks. Thus a man, who by means of his military service is placed under the necessity of thinking about the significance of the state, in the name of which the sacrifice of his peace, his security, and his life is demanded of him, cannot help but see clearly that for these sacrifices there no longer exists any basis in our time. But it is not only by theoretical reflections that any man may see that the sacrifices demanded of him by the state have no foundation whatever, even by reflecting practically, that is, by weighing all those hard conditions in which a man is placed by the state. No one can fail to see that for him personally the fulfillment of the demands of the state and his submission to military service is in the majority of cases more disadvantageous than a refusal to do military service. If the majority of men prefer submission to insubmission, this is not due to any sober weighing of the advantages and disadvantages, but because the men are attracted to submission by means of the hypnotization to which they are subjected in the matter. In submitting, men only surrender themselves to those demands which are made upon them without reflection and without making any effort of the will, for in submission there is a need of independent reflection and of effort of which not every man is capable. But if, excluding the moral significance of submission and insubmission, we should consider nothing but the advantages, insubmission would in general always be more advantageous to us than submission. No matter who I may be, whether I belong to the well-to-do, oppressing classes, or to the oppressed laboring classes, the disadvantages of insubmission are less than the disadvantages of submission, and the advantages of insubmission are greater than the advantages of submission. If I belong to the minority of oppressors, the disadvantages of insubmission to the demands of the government will consist in this, that I, refusing to comply with the demands of the government, shall be tried and at best shall be discharged or as they do with the Mennonites, shall be compelled to serve out my time at some unmilitary work. In the worst case, I shall be condemned to deportation or imprisonment for 2 or 3 years. I speak from examples that have happened in Russia, or perhaps to a longer term of incarceration or to death, though the probability of such a penalty is very small. Such are the disadvantages of insubmission, but the disadvantages of submission will consist in this. At best, I shall not be sent out to kill men, and I myself shall not be subjected to any great probability of crippling or death, but shall only be enlisted as a military slave. I shall be dressed up in a fool's garments. I shall be at the mercy of every man above me in rank, from a corporal to a field marshal. I shall be compelled to contort my body according to their desire, and after being kept from 1 to 5 years, I shall be left for 10 years in a condition of readiness to appear at any moment for the purpose of going through all these things again. In the worst case, I shall, in addition to all those previous conditions of slavery, be sent to war, where I shall be compelled to kill men of other nations who have done me no harm, where I may be crippled and killed, and where I may get into a place, as happened at Sevastopol and as happens in every war, where men are sent to certain death, and, what is most agonizing, I may be sent out against my own countrymen, when I shall be compelled to kill my brothers for dynastic or other reasons, which are entirely alien to me. Such are the comparative disadvantages. The comparative advantages of submission and of insubmission are these. For him who has not refused, the advantages will consist in this, that, having submitted to all the humiliations and having executed all the cruelties demanded of him, he may, if he is not killed, receive red, golden, tinfoil decorations over his fool's garments, and he may at best command hundreds of thousands of just such bestialized men as himself, and be called a field marshal and receive a lot of money. But the advantages of him who refuses will consist in this, that he will retain his human dignity, will earn the respect of good men, and, above all else, will know without fail that he is doing God's work and so an incontestable good to men. Such are the advantages and the disadvantages on both sides for a man from the wealthy classes, for an oppressor, for a man of the poor. Working classes, the advantages and disadvantages will be the same, but with an important addition of disadvantages. The disadvantages for a man of the laboring classes who has not refused to do military service will also consist in this, that, by entering upon military service, he by his participation and seeming consent confirms the very oppression under which he is suffering. But it is not the reflections as to how much the state which men are called upon to support by their participation in the military service is necessary and useful to men, much less the reflections as to the advantages or disadvantages accruing to each man from his submission or insubmission to the demands of the government, that decide the question as to the necessity of the existence or the abolition of the state. What irrevocably and without appeal decides this question is the religious consciousness or conscience of every individual man, before whom, in connection with the universal military service, involuntarily rises the question as to the existence or non-existence of the state. Chapter 8. People frequently say that if Christianity is a truth, it ought to have been accepted by all men at its very appearance, and ought at that very moment to have changed the lives of men and made them better. But to say this is the same as saying that if the seed is fertile, it must immediately produce a sprout, a flower, and a fruit. The Christian teaching is no legislation which, being introduced by violence, can at once change the lives of men. Christianity is another, newer, higher concept of life, which is different from the previous one. But the new concept of life cannot be prescribed, it can only be freely adopted. Now the new life conception can be acquired only in 2 ways, in a spiritual, internal, and an experimental, external way. Some people, the minority, immediately, at once, by a prophetic feeling divine the truth of the teaching, abandon themselves to it and execute it. Others, the majority, are led only through a long path of errors, experiences, and sufferings to the recognition of the truth of the teaching and the necessity of acquiring it. It is to this necessity of acquiring the teaching in an experimental external way that the whole mass of the men of the Christian world have now been brought. Sometimes we think, What need was there for that corruption of Christianity, which even now more than anything else interferes with its adoption in its real sense? And yet this corruption of Christianity, having brought men to the condition in which they now are, was a necessary condition for the majority of men to be able to receive it in its real significance. If Christianity had been offered to men in its real, and not its corrupted, form, it would not have been accepted by the majority of men, and the majority of men would have remained alien to it, as the nations of Asia are alien to it at the present time. But, having received it in its corrupted form, the nations who received it were subjected to its certain, though slow, action. And by a long experimental road of errors and of sufferings resulting therefrom are now brought to the necessity of acquiring it in its true sense. The corruption of Christianity and its acceptance in its corrupted form by the majority of men was as indispensable as that a seed, to sprout, should be for a time concealed by the earth. The Christian teaching is a teaching of the truth and at the same time a prophecy. 1800 years ago, the Christian teaching revealed to men the truth of how they should live, and at the same time predicted what human life would be if men would not live thus, but would continue to live by those principles by which they had lived heretofore, and what it would be if they should accept the Christian teaching and should carry it out in life. In imparting in the Sermon on the Mount the teaching which was to guide the lives of men, Christ said, "Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock, and the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand, and the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it." Matthew 7 verse 24-27. Now, after 1800 years, the prophecy has been fulfilled. By not following Christ's teaching in general and its manifestation in public life as non-resistance to evil, men involuntarily came to that position of inevitable ruin which was promised by Christ to those who would not follow his teaching. People frequently think that the question of non-resistance to evil is an invented question, a question which it is possible to circumvent. It is, however, a question which life itself puts before all men and before every thinking man, and which invariably demands a solution. For men in their public life, this question has, ever since the Christian teaching has been preached, been the same as the question for a traveler which road to take, when he comes to a fork on the highway on which he has been walking. He must go on, and he cannot say, "I will not think, and I will continue to walk as before." Before this there was one road, and now there are two of them, and it is impossible to walk as before, and one of the two roads must inevitably be chosen. Even so, it has been impossible to say, "Ever since Christ's teaching was made known to men, I will continue to live as I lived before," without solving the question as to resisting or not resisting evil by means of violence. It is inevitably necessary at the appearance of every struggle to solve the question, shall I with violence resist that which I consider to be an evil and violence or not? The question as to resisting or not resisting evil by means of violence appeared when there arose the first struggle among men, since every struggle is nothing but a resistance by means of violence to what each of the contending parties considers to be an evil. But the men before Christ did not see that the resistance by means of violence to what each considers to be an evil, only because he regards as an evil what another regards as a good, is only one of the means of solving the struggle, and that another means consists in not at all resisting evil by means of violence. Previous to Christ's teaching, it appeared to men that there was but one way of solving a struggle, and that was by resisting evil with violence, and so they did. Each of the contending parties trying to convince himself and others that what each of them considered to be an evil was a real, absolute evil. And so, since most remote times men have endeavored to discover such definitions of evil as would be obligatory for all men, and as such were given out the statutes of law which, it was assumed, were received in a supernatural manner, or the injunctions of men or of assemblies of men, to whom is ascribed the quality of infallibility. Men have employed violence against other men, and have assured themselves and others that they have employed this violence against the evil which was acknowledged by all men. This means has been employed since remote antiquity, especially by those men who usurped the power, and men for a long time did not see the irrationality of this means. But the longer men lived, the more complex their relations became, the more obvious did it become that it was irrational by means of violence to resist that which is by everyone regarded as an evil, that the struggle was not diminished by doing so, and that no human definitions could succeed in making that which was considered to be evil by one set of men considered such by others. Even at the time of the appearance of Christianity, in the place where it made its appearance, in the Roman Empire, it was clear for the majority of men that what by Nero and Caligula was considered to be an evil which ought to be resisted with violence could not be considered an evil by other men. Even then, men began to understand that human laws which were given out as being divine had been written by men, that men could not be infallible, no matter with what external grandeur they might be vested, and that erring men could not become infallible simply because they came together and called themselves a senate or some such name. This was even then felt and understood by many, and it was then that Christ preached his teaching, which did not consist simply in this, that evil ought not to be resisted by means of violence, but in the teaching of the new comprehension of life, apart, or rather an application of which to public life was the teaching about the means for abolishing the struggle among all men, not by obliging only one part of men without a struggle to submit to what would be prescribed to them by certain authorities, but by having no one, consequently even not those, and preeminently not those, who rule, employ violence against anyone and under no consideration. The teaching was at that time accepted by but a small number of disciples, but the majority of men, especially all those who ruled over men, continued after the nominal acceptance of Christianity to hold to the rule of violently resisting that which they considered to be evil. Thus it was in the time of the Roman and the Byzantine emperors, and so it continued even afterward. The inadequacy of the principle of defining with authority what is evil and resisting it with violence, which was already obvious in the first centuries of Christianity, became even more obvious during the decomposition of the Roman Empire into many states of equal right, with their mutual hostilities and the inner struggles which took place in the separate states. But men were not prepared to receive the solution which was given by Christ, and the former means for the definition of the evil, which had to be resisted by establishing laws which, being obligatory for all, were carried out by the use of force, continued to be applied. The arbiter of what was to be considered an evil and what was to be resisted by means of force was now the Pope, now the Emperor, now the King, now an assembly of the elect, now the whole nation. But both inside and outside the state there always existed some men who did not recognize the obligatoriness for themselves either of the injunctions which were given out to be the commands of the divinity, or of the decrees of men who were vested with sanctity, or of the institutions which purported to represent the will of the people, and these men, who considered to be good what the existing powers regarded as evil, fought against the powers, using the same violence which was directed against themselves. Men who were vested with sanctity regarded as evil what men and institutions that were vested with civil power considered to be good, and vice versa, and the struggle became ever more acute. And the more such people held to this method for solving their struggle, the more obvious did it become that this method was useless, because there is and there can be no such external authority for the definition of evil as would be recognized by all men. Thus it lasted for 1800 years, and it reached the present point, the complete obviousness of the fact that there is and there can be no external definition of evil which would be obligatory for all men. It reached such a point that men ceased to believe in the possibility of finding this common definition which would be obligatory for all men, and even in the necessity of putting forward such a definition. It came to such a pass that the men in power stopped proving that that which they considered to be an evil was an evil, and said outright that they considered that an evil which did not please them, and the men who obeyed the power began to obey it. Not because they believed that the definitions of evil given by this power were correct, but only because they could not help but obey. Nice is added to France, Lorraine to Germany, Bohemia to Austria, Poland is divided, Ireland and India are subjected to English rule, war is waged against China and the Africans, the Americans expel the Chinese, and the Russians oppress the Jews. The landowners use the land which they do not work, and the capitalists make use of the labors of others, not because this is good, useful, and needful to men, and because the contrary is evil, but because those who are in power want it to be so. What has happened is what happens now. One set of men commit acts of violence, no longer in the name of resisting evil, but in the name of their advantage or whim, while another set submit to violence, not because they assume, as was the case formerly. That violence is exerted against them in the name of freeing them from evil and for their good, but only because they cannot free themselves from this violence. If a Roman, a man of the Middle Ages, a Russian, as I remember him to have been 50 years ago, was incontestably convinced that the existing violence of the power was necessary in order to free him from evil, that taxes, levies, serf law, prisons, whips, knouts, hard labor, capital punishment, militarism, wars must exist, it will be hard now to find a man who either believes that all acts of violence free anyone from anything, or even does not see clearly that the majority of all those cases of violence to which he is subject and in which he partly shares are in themselves a great and useless evil. There is now no such a man who does not see, not only the uselessness, but even the insipidity of collecting taxes from the laboring classes for the purpose of enriching idle officials, or the senselessness of imposing punishments upon corrupt and weak people in the shape of deportation from one place to another, or in the form of imprisonment in jails, where they live in security and idleness and become more corrupted and weakened, or not the uselessness and insipidity, but simply the madness and cruelty of military preparations and wars, which ruin and destroy the masses and have no explanation and justification, and yet these cases of violence are continued and even maintained by the very men who see their uselessness, insipidity, and cruelty and suffer from them. If 50 years ago a rich idle man and an ignorant laboring man were both equally convinced that their condition of an eternal holiday for the one and of eternal labor for the other was ordained by God himself, it is now, not only in Europe, but even in Russia, thanks to the migration of the populace and the dissemination of culture and printing, hard to find either a rich or a poor man who, from one side or another, has not been assailed by doubts of the justice of such an order of things. Not only do the rich know that they are guilty even because they are rich, and try to redeem their guilt by offering contributions to art and science, as formerly they redeemed their sins by means of contributions to the churches, but even the greater half of the working people recognize the present order as being false and subject to destruction or change. One set of religious people, of whom there are millions in Russia, the so-called sectarians, recognize this order as false and subject to destruction on the basis of the gospel teaching as taken in its real meaning. Others consider it to be false on the basis of socialistic, communistic, anarchistic theories, which now have penetrated into the lower strata of the working people. Violence is now no longer maintained on the ground that it is necessary, but only that it has existed for a long time, and has been so organized by men to whom it is advantageous, that is, by governments and the ruling classes, that the men who are in their power cannot tear themselves away from it. The governments in our time, all governments, the most despotic and the most liberal, have become what Herzen so aptly called Genghis Khans with telegraphs, that is, organizations of violence, which have nothing at their base but the coarsest arbitrary will, and yet use all those means which science has worked out for the aggregate social peaceful activity of free and equal men, and which they now employ for the enslavement and oppression of men. The governments and the ruling classes do not now lean on the right, not even on the semblance of justice, but on an artificial organization which, with the aid of the perfections of science, encloses all men in the circle of violence, from which there is no possibility of tearing themselves away. This circle is now composed of 4 means of influencing men. All those means are connected and sustain one another as the links in the ring of a united chain. The first, the oldest, means is the means of intimidation. This means consists in representing the existing state structure, no matter what it may be, whether a free republic or the wildest despotism, as something sacred and invariable, and so in inflicting the severest penalties for any attempt at changing it. This means, having been used before, is even now used in an unchanged form wherever there are governments: in Russia, against the so-called nihilists; in America, against the anarchists; in France, against the imperialists, monarchists, communists, and anarchists. The railways, telegraphs, photographs, and the perfected method of removing people, without killing them, into eternal solitary confinement, where, hidden from men, they perish and are forgotten, and many other modern inventions, which governments employ more freely than anyone else, give them such strength that as soon as the power has fallen into certain hands, and the visible and the secret police, and the administration, and all kinds of prosecutors and jailers, and executioners are earnestly at work, there is no possibility of overthrowing the government, no matter how senseless or cruel it may be. The second means is that of bribery. It consists in taking the wealth away from the laboring classes in the shape of monetary taxes and distributing this wealth among the officials, who for this remuneration are obliged to maintain and strengthen the enslavement of the masses. These bribed officials, from the highest ministers to the lowest scribes, who, forming one continuous chain of men, are united by the same interest of supporting themselves by the labors of the masses, and grow wealthier in proportion as they more humbly do the will of their governments, always and everywhere, stopping short before no means, in all branches of activity, in word and deed, defend the governmental violence, upon which their very well-being is based. The third means is what I cannot call by any other name than the hypnotization of the people. This means consists in retarding the spiritual development of men and maintaining them with all kinds of suggestions in a concept of life which humanity has already outlived and on which the power of the governments is based. This hypnotization is at the present time organized in the most complex manner and, beginning its action in childhood, continues over men to their death. This hypnotization begins at early youth in compulsory schools which are established for the purpose, and in which the children are instilled with world conceptions which were peculiar to their ancestors and are directly opposed to the modern consciousness of humanity. In countries in which there is a state religion, the children are taught the senseless blasphemies of ecclesiastical catechisms, in which the necessity of obeying the powers is pointed out. In republican governments, they are taught the savage superstition of patriotism and the same imaginary obligation of obeying the authorities. At a more advanced age, this hypnotization is continued by encouraging the religious and the patriotic superstitions. The religious superstition is encouraged by means of the institution of churches, processions, monuments, festivities, from the money collected from the masses, and these, with the aid of painting, architecture, music, incense, but chiefly by the maintenance of the so-called clergy, stupefy the masses. Their duty consists in this, that with their representations, the pathos of the services, their sermons, their interference in the private lives of the people, at births, marriages, deaths, they bedim the people and keep them in an eternal condition of stupefaction. The patriotic superstition is encouraged by means of public celebrations, spectacles, monuments, festivities, which are arranged by the governments and the ruling classes on the money collected from the masses, and which make people prone to recognize the exclusive importance of their own nation and the grandeur of their own state and rulers, and to be ill-inclined toward all other nations, and even hate them. In connection with this, the despotic governments directly prohibit the printing and dissemination of books and the utterance of speeches which enlighten the masses, and deport or incarcerate all men who are likely to rouse the masses from their lethargy. Besides, all governments without exception conceal from the masses everything which could free them and encourage everything which could corrupt them, such as the authorship of books which maintain the masses in the savagery of their religious and patriotic superstitions, all kinds of sensuous amusements, spectacles, circuses, theaters, and even all kinds of physical intoxications, such as tobacco and brandy, which furnish the chief income of states. They even encourage prostitution, which is not only acknowledged, but even organized by the majority of governments, such as the third means. The fourth means consists in this, That with the aid of the three preceding means there is segregated, from the men so fettered and stupefied, a certain small number of men, who are subjected to intensified methods of stupefaction and brutalization, and are turned into involuntary tools of all those cruelties and bestialities which the governments may need. This stupefaction and brutalization is accomplished by taking the men at that youthful age when they have not yet had time to form any firm convictions in regard to morality, and, having removed them from all natural conditions of human life, from home, family, native district, rational labor, locking them all up together in narrow barracks, dressing them up in peculiar garments, and making them, under the influence of shouts, drums, music, glittering objects, perform daily exercises specially, invented for the purpose, and thus inducing such a state of hypnosis in them that they cease to be men and become unthinking machines, which are obedient to the command of the hypnotizer. These hypnotized, physically strong young men, all young men, on account of the present universal military service, who are provided with instruments of murder, and who are always obedient to the power of the governments and are prepared to commit any act of violence at their command, form the fourth and chief means for the enslavement of men. With this means the circle of violence is closed. Intimidation, bribery, hypnotization make men desirous to become soldiers, but it is the soldiers who give the power and the possibility for punishing people and picking them clean and bribing the officials with the money thus obtained, and for hypnotizing and enlisting them again as soldiers who in turn afford the possibility for doing all this. The circle is closed, and there is no way of tearing oneself away from it by means of force. If some men affirm that the liberation from violence, or even its weakening, may be effected, should the oppressed people overthrow the oppressing government by force and substitute a new one for it, a government in which such violence and enslavement would not be necessary, and if some men actually try to do so, they only deceive themselves and others by it, and thus fail to improve men's condition and even make it worse. The activity of these men only intensifies the despotism of the governments. The attempts of these men at freeing themselves only give the governments a convenient excuse for strengthening their power and actually provoke its strengthening. Even if we admit that, in consequence of an unfortunate concurrence of events in the government, as, for example, in France in the year 1870, some governments may be overthrown by force and the power pass into other hands. This power would in no case be less oppressive than the former one, and, defending itself against the infuriated deposed enemies, would always be more despotic and cruel than the former, as indeed has been the case in every revolution. If the socialists and communists consider the individualistic, capitalistic structure of society to be an evil, and the anarchists consider the government itself to be an evil, there are also monarchists, conservatives, capitalists, who consider the socialistic, communistic, and anarchistic order to be evil, and all these parties have no other means than force for the purpose of uniting men. No matter which of these parties may triumph, it will be compelled, for the materialization of its tenets, as well as for the maintenance of its power, not only to make use of all the existing means of violence, but also to invent new ones. Other men will be enslaved, and men will be compelled to do something else, but there will be not only the same, but even a more cruel form of violence and enslavement, because, in consequence of the struggle, the hatred of men toward one another will be intensified, and at the same time new means of enslavement will be worked out and confirmed. Thus it has always been after every revolution, every attempt at a revolution, every plot, every violent change of government. Every struggle only strengthens the means of the enslavement of those who at a given time are in power. The condition of the men of our Christian world, and especially the current ideals themselves, prove this in a striking manner. There is left but one sphere of human activity which is not usurped by the governmental power, the domestic, economic sphere, the sphere of the private life and of labor. But even this sphere, thanks to the struggle of the communists and socialists, is slowly being usurped by the governments, so that labor and rest, the domicile, the attire, the food of men will by degrees be determined and directed by the governments, if the wishes of the reformers are to be fulfilled. The whole long, 18 centuries-old course of the life of the Christian nations has inevitably brought them back to the necessity of solving the question, so long evaded by them, as to the acceptance or non-acceptance of Christ's teaching, and the solution of the question resulting from it as regards the social life, whether to resist or not to resist evil with violence, but with this difference, that formerly men could accept the solution which Christianity offered, or not accept it, while now the solution has become imperative because it alone frees them from that condition of slavery in which they have become entangled as in a snare. But it is not merely the wretchedness of men's condition that brings them to this necessity. Side by side with the negative proof of the falseness of the pagan structure, there went the positive proof of the truth of the Christian teaching. There was a good reason why, in the course of 18 centuries, the best men of the whole Christian world, having recognized the truths of the teaching by means of an inner, spiritual method, should have borne witness to them before men, in spite of all threats, privations, calamities, and torments. With this their martyrdom, these best men have put the stamp of truthfulness upon the teaching and have transmitted it to the masses. Christianity penetrated into the consciousness of humanity, not merely by the one negative way of proving the impossibility of continuing the pagan life, but also by its simplification, elucidation, liberation from the dross of superstitions, and dissemination among all the classes of people. 1800 years of the profession of Christianity did not pass in vain for the men who accepted it, even though only in an external manner. These 18 centuries have had this effect that, continuing to live a pagan life, which does not correspond to the age of humanity, men have not only come to see clearly the whole wretchedness of the condition in which they are, but believe in the depth of their hearts. They live only because they believe, in this, that the salvation from this condition is only in the fulfillment of the Christian teaching in its true significance. As to when and how this salvation will take place, all men think differently, in accordance with their mental development and the current prejudices of their circle. But every man of our world recognizes the fact that our salvation lies in the fulfillment of the Christian teaching. Some believers, recognizing the Christian teaching as divine, think that the salvation will come when all men shall believe in Christ and the second advent shall approach. Others, who also recognize the divinity of Christ's teaching, think that this salvation will come through the Church, which, subjecting all men to itself, will educate in them Christian virtues and will change their lives. Others again, who do not recognize Christ as God, think that the salvation of men will come through a slow, gradual progress, when the foundations of the pagan life will slowly give way to the foundations of liberty, equality, fraternity, that is, to Christian principles. Others again, who preach a social transformation, think that the salvation will come when men by a violent revolution shall be compelled to adopt community of possession, absence of government, and collective, not individual, labor, that is, the materialization of one of the sides of the Christian teaching. In one way or another, all men of our time in their consciousness not only reject the present obsolete pagan order of life, but recognize, frequently not knowing it themselves and regarding themselves as enemies of Christianity, that our salvation lies only in the application of the Christian teaching or of a part of it in its true meaning to life. For the majority of men, as its teacher has said, Christianity could not be realized at once, but had to grow, like an immense tree, from a small seed. And so it grew and has spread, if not in reality, at least in the consciousness of the men of our time. Now it is not merely the minority of men who always comprehended Christianity internally that recognizes it in its true meaning, but also that vast majority of men which on account of its social life seems to be so far removed from Christianity. Look at the private life of separate individuals. Listen to those valuations of acts which men make in judging one another. Listen not only to the public sermons and lectures, but also to those instructions which parents and educators give to their charges, and you will see that, no matter how far the political, social life of men, which is united through violence, is from the realization of Christian truths in private life, it is only the Christian virtues that are by all and for all, without exception and indubitably considered to be good, and that the anti-Christian vices are by all and for all, without exception and indubitably considered to be bad. Those are considered to be the best of men who renounce and sacrifice their lives in the service of humanity and who sacrifice themselves for others. Those are considered to be the worst who are selfish, who exploit the misery of their neighbors for their own personal advantage. If by some who have not yet been touched by Christianity are recognized the non-Christian ideals, force, valor, wealth, these are ideals which are not experienced and shared by all men, and certainly not by men who are considered to be the best. The condition of our Christian humanity, if viewed from without, with its cruelty and its slavery, is really terrible. But if we look upon it from the side of its consciousness, an entirely different spectacle is presented to us. The whole evil of our life seems to exist for no other reason than that it was done long ago, and the men who have done it have not yet had time to learn how not to do it, though none of them wish to do it. All this evil seems to exist for some other reason, which is independent of the consciousness of men. No matter how strange and contradictory this may seem, all the men of our time despise the very order of things which they help to maintain. I think it is Max Miller who tells of the surprise of an Indian converted to Christianity, who, having grasped the essence of the Christian teaching, arrived in Europe and saw the life of the Christians. He could not recover from his astonishment in the presence of the reality, which was the very opposite of what he had expected to find among the Christian nations. If we are not surprised at the contradiction between our beliefs, convictions, and acts, this is due only to the fact that the influences which conceal this contradiction from men act also upon us. We need only look upon our life from the standpoint of the Indian, who understood Christianity in its real significance, without any compromises and adaptations, and upon those savage bestialities with which our life is filled, in order that we may be frightened at the contradictions amidst which we live, frequently without noticing them. We need but think of warlike preparations, mitrailleuses, silver-plated bullets, torpedoes, and the Red Cross, of the construction of prisons with solitary cells, of the experiments at electrocution, and of the benevolent cares for the imprisoned, of the philanthropic activity of rich men, and of their lives, which are productive of those very poor whom they benefit. And these contradictions do not result, as may appear, because people pretend to be Christians, when in reality they are pagans, but on the contrary, because people lack something, or because there is some force which keeps them from being what they already feel themselves to be in their consciousness and what they actually wish to be. The men of our time do not pretend to hate oppression, inequality, the division of men, and all kinds of cruelty, not only toward men, but also toward animals. They actually do hate all this, but they do not know how to destroy it all. And they have not the courage to part with what maintains all this and seems to them to be indispensable. Indeed, ask any man of our time privately whether he considers it laudable or even worthy of a man of our time to busy himself with collecting taxes from the masses, who frequently are poverty-stricken, receiving for this work a salary which is entirely out of proportion with his labor, this money to be used for the construction of cannon, torpedoes, and implements for murdering men, with whom we wish to be at peace and who wish to be at peace with us, or for a salary to devote all his life to the construction of these implements of murder, or to prepare himself and others to commit murder. And ask him whether it is laudable and worthy of a man, and proper for a Christian, to busy himself, again for money, with catching unfortunate, erring, frequently ignorant, drunken men for appropriating to themselves other people's possessions in much smaller quantities than we appropriate things to ourselves, and for killing men differently from what we are accustomed to kill men, and for this to put them in prisons and torment, and kill them, and whether it is laudable and worthy of a man. And a Christian, again for money, to preach to the masses, instead of Christianity, what is well known to be insipid and harmful superstitions, and whether it is laudable and worthy of a man to take from his neighbor, for the sake of his own lust, what his neighbor needs for the gratification of his prime necessities, as is done by the large landowners, or to compel him to perform labor above his strength, which ruins his life, in order to increase his own wealth, as is done by manufacturers, by owners of factories, or to exploit men's want for the purpose of increasing his wealth, as is done by merchants. And each of them taken privately, especially in speaking of another, will tell you that it is not. And yet this same man, who sees all the execrableness of these acts, who is himself not urged by anyone, will himself voluntarily, and frequently without the monetary advantage of a salary, for the sake of childish vanity, for the sake of a porcelain trinket, a ribbon, a piece of lace, which he is permitted to put on, go into military service, become an examining magistrate, a justice of the peace, a minister, a rural officer, a bishop, a sexton, that is, he will take an office in which he is obliged to do things the disgrace and execrableness of which he cannot help but know. I know many of these men will self-conceitedly prove that they consider their positions not only legitimate, but even indispensable. They will say in their defense that the power is from God, that political offices are necessary for the good of humanity, that wealth is not contrary to Christianity, that the rich young man was told to give up his wealth only if he wished to be perfect, that the now existing distribution of wealth and commerce must be so and is advantageous for everybody, and so forth. But no matter how they may try to deceive themselves and others, all these men know that what they do is contrary to everything they believe in, and in the name of which they live, and in the depth of their hearts, when they are left alone with their consciences. They think with shame and pain of what they are doing, especially if the execrableness of their activity has been pointed out to them. A man of our time, whether he professes the divinity of Christ or not, cannot help but know that to take part, whether as a king, a minister, a governor, or a rural officer, in the sale of a poor family's last cow for taxes, with which to pay for cannon or the salaries and pensions of luxuriating, idle, and harmful officials, or to have a share in putting the provider of a family into prison because we ourselves have corrupted him and let his family go a-begging, or to take part in the plunders and murders of war, or to help substitute savage and idolatrous superstitions for Christ's law, or to detain a trespassing cow of a man who has no land of his own, or to deduct a sum from the wages of a factory hand for an article which he accidentally ruined, or to extort a double price from a poor fellow, only because he is in need. A man of our time cannot help but know that all these things are disgraceful and execrable, and that they should not be done. They all know it. They know that what they do is bad, and they would not be doing it under any consideration if they were able to withstand those forces which, closing their eyes to the criminality of their acts, draw them on to committing them. In nothing is the degree of the contradiction which the lives of the men of our time have reached so striking, as in that phenomenon which forms the last means and expression of violence in the universal military service. Only because this condition of universal arming and military service has come step by step and imperceptibly, and because for its maintenance the governments employ all means in their power for intimidating, bribing, stupefying, and ravishing men, we do not see the crying contradiction between this condition and those Christian feelings and thoughts with which all the men of our time are really permeated. This contradiction has become so habitual to us that we do not even see all the terrifying senselessness and immorality of the acts, not only of the men who voluntarily choose the profession of killing as something honorable, but even of those unfortunate men who agree to perform military duty, or even of those who, in countries where military service is not introduced, voluntarily give up their labors to hire soldiers and prepare them to commit murder. All these men, be they Christians or men who profess humanity and liberalism, certainly know that, in committing these crimes, they become the participants and, in personal military service, the actors in the most senseless, aimless, cruel of murders, and yet they commit them. But more than this, in Germany, whence comes the universal military service, Caprivi said openly, what before was carefully concealed, that the men who had to be killed were not merely the foreigners, but the working people, from whom come the majority of the soldiers. And this confession did not open men's eyes, did not frighten them. Even after this, as before, they continue to go like sheep to the enlistment and to submit to everything demanded of them. And this is not enough. Lately, the German emperor stated more definitely the significance and the calling of a soldier when distinguishing, thanking, and rewarding a soldier for having shot a defenseless prisoner who had attempted to run away. In thanking and rewarding the man for an act which has always been regarded as the lowest and basest by men who stand on the lowest stage of morality, Wilhelm showed that the chief duty of a soldier, the one most valued by the authorities, consisted in being an executioner, not one like the professional executioners who kill only condemned criminals, but one who kills all those innocent men whom he is ordered by his superiors to kill. But more than this, in 1891 this same Wilhelm, the enfant terrible of the political power, who expresses what others think, in speaking with some soldiers, said the following in public. And the next day thousands of newspapers reprinted these words. "Recruits, in the sight of the altar and the servant of God you swore allegiance to me. You are still too young to understand the true meaning of everything which is said here, but see to this, that you first of all follow the commands and instructions given you. You have sworn allegiance to me. This, children of my guard, means that you are now my soldiers, that you have surrendered your souls and bodies to me. For you there now exists but one enemy, namely, the one who is my enemy. With the present socialistic propaganda, it may happen that I will command you to shoot at your own relatives, your brothers, even parents, which God forfend, and then you are obliged without murmuring to do my commands." This man expresses what all wise men know, but carefully conceal. He says frankly that men who serve in the army serve him and his advantage, and must be prepared for his advantage to kill their brothers and fathers. He expresses frankly and with the coarsest of words all the horror of the crime for which the men who enter into military service are prepared, all that abyss of degradation which they reach when they promise obedience. Like a bold hypnotizer, he tests the degree of the hypnotized man's sleep. He puts the glowing iron to his body. The body sizzles and smokes, but the hypnotized man does not wake. This miserable, ill man, who has lost his mind from the exercise of power, with these words offends everything which can be holy for a man of our time, and men, Christians, liberals, cultured men of our time, all of them, are not only not provoked by this insult, but even do not notice it. The last extreme trial, in its coarsest, most glaring form, is offered to men, and men do not even seem to notice that this is a trial, that they have a choice. It looks as though it seemed to them that there was not even any choice, and that there was but the one path of slavish obedience. One would think that these senseless words, which offend everything which a man of our time considers to be sacred, ought to have provoked people, but nothing of the kind took place. All the young men of all Europe are year after year subjected to this trial, and with the rarest exceptions, they all renounce everything which is and can be sacred to a man. They all express their readiness to kill their brothers, even their fathers, at the command of the first erring man who is clad in a red livery embroidered with gold, and all they ask is when and whom to kill. And they're ready. Every savage has something sacred for which he is prepared to suffer and for which he will make no concessions. But where is the sacredness for a man of our time? He is told, "Go into slavery to me, into a slavery in which you have to kill your own father," and he, who very frequently is a learned man, who has studied all the sciences in a university, submissively puts his neck into the yoke. He is dressed up in a fool's attire, is commanded to jump, to contort his body, to bow, to kill, and he does everything submissively. And when he is let out, he returns briskly to his former life and continues to talk of man's dignity, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yes, but what is to be done? People frequently ask, in sincere perplexity, "If all should refuse, it would be well. Otherwise I alone shall suffer, and no one will be helped by it." And indeed, a man of the social concept of life cannot refuse. The meaning of his life is the good of his personality. For the sake of his personality, it is better for him to submit, and he submits. No matter what may be done to him, no matter how he may be tortured and degraded, he will submit, because he can do nothing himself, because he has not that foundation in the name of which he could by himself withstand the violence. But those who govern men will never give them a chance to unite. It is frequently said that the invention of terrible implements of murder will abolish war, and that war will abolish itself. That is not true. As it is possible to increase the means for the slaughter of men, so it is possible to increase the means for subjugating the men of the social concept of life. Let them be killed by the thousand, by the million and be torn to pieces, they will nonetheless go to the slaughter like senseless cattle, because they are driven with a goad. Others will go, because for this they will be permitted to put on ribbons and galloons, and they will even be proud of it. And it is in connection with such a contingent of men who are so stupefied that they promise to kill their parents that the public leaders, the conservatives, liberals, socialists, anarchists, talk of building up a rational and moral society. What rational and moral society can be built up with such men? Just as it is impossible to build a house with rotten and crooked logs, no matter how one may transpose them, so it is impossible with such people to construct a rational and moral society. Such people can only form a herd of animals which is directed by the shouts and goads of the shepherds. And so it is. And so, on the one hand, Christians by name, who profess liberty, equality, and fraternity, are side by side with that prepared in the name of liberty for the most slavish and degraded submission, in the name of equality for the most glaring and senseless divisions of men by external signs alone into superiors and inferiors, their allies and their enemies, and in the name of fraternity for the murder of these brothers. Point 26. The contradictions of consciousness and the resulting wretchedness of life have reached the extremist point, beyond which it is impossible to go. The life which is built up on the principles of violence has reached the negation of those very principles in the name of which it was built up. The establishment of society on the principles of violence, which had for its aim the security of the personal, domestic, and social good, has led men to a complete negation and destruction of this good. The first part of the prophecy has been fulfilled in respect to men and their generations who did not accept the teaching, and their descendants have now been brought to the necessity of experiencing the justice of its second part. Chapter 9. The condition of the Christian nations in our time has remained as cruel as it was in the times of paganism. In many relations, especially in the enslavement of men, it has become even more cruel than in the times of paganism. But between the condition of the men of that time and of our time, there is the same difference that there is for the plants between the last days of autumn and the first days of spring. There, in the autumnal nature, the external lifelessness corresponds to the internal condition of decay, but here, in the spring, the external lifelessness is in the sharpest contradiction to the condition of the internal restoration and the change to a new form of life. The same is true of the external resemblance between the previous pagan life and the present one. The external condition of men in the times of paganism and in our time is quite different. There, the external condition of cruelty and slavery was in full agreement with the internal consciousness of men, and every forward movement increased this agreement. But here the external condition of cruelty and slavery is in complete disagreement with the Christian consciousness of men, and every forward step only increases this disagreement. What is taking place is, as it were, useless sufferings, something resembling childbirth. Everything is prepared for the new life, but the life itself has not made its appearance. The situation seems to be without an issue, and it would be so if the individual man, and so all men, were not given the possibility of another, higher conception of life, which at once frees him from all those fetters which, it seemed, bound him indissolubly. Such is the Christian concept of life, which was pointed out to humanity 1800 years ago. A man need only make this life concept his own, in order that the chains which seem to have fettered him so indissolubly may fall off of themselves, and that he may feel himself quite free. Something the way a bird would feel free when it expanded its wings in a place which is fenced in all around. People speak of the liberation of the Christian church from the state, of granting or not granting liberty to Christians. In these thoughts and expressions there is some terrible misconception. Liberty cannot be granted to a Christian or to Christians or taken from them. Liberty is a Christian's inalienable property. When people speak of granting liberty to Christians or taking it from them, it is evident that they are not speaking of real Christians, but of men who call themselves Christians. A Christian cannot be anything else but free, because the attainment of the end which he has set before himself cannot be retarded or detained by anyone or anything. A man need but understand his life as Christianity teaches him to understand it, that is, understand that life does not belong to him, his personality, or the family, or the state, but to him who sent him into this life, that, therefore, he must not fulfill the law of his personality, his family, or the state, but the unlimited law of him from whom he has come, in order that he may feel himself quite free from every human power and may even stop seeing this power as something which may be oppressive for anyone. A man need but understand that the aim of his life is the fulfillment of God's law, in order that this law, taking for him the place of all other laws and subjugating him to itself, by this very subjugation may deprive all the human laws in his eyes of all their obligatoriness and oppression. A Christian is freed from every human power in that he considers for his life and for the lives of others the divine law of love, which is implanted in the soul of every man and is brought into consciousness by Christ, as the only guide of his life and of that of other men. A Christian may submit to external violence, may be deprived of his bodily freedom, may not be free from his passions. He who commits a sin is a slave of sin, but he cannot help but be free, in the sense of not being compelled by some danger or external threat to commit an act which is contrary to his consciousness. He cannot be compelled to do this, because the privations and sufferings which are produced by violence, and which form a mighty tool against the men of the social concept of life, have no compulsory force with him. The privations and sufferings which take from the men of the social concept of life the good for which they live cannot impair the Christian's good, which consists in the fulfillment of God's will. They can only strengthen him when they assail him in the performance of this will. And so a Christian, in submitting to the internal, divine law, cannot only not perform the prescription of the external law when it is not in accord with the divine law of love as recognized by him, as is the case in the demands set forth by the government, but cannot even recognize the obligation of obeying anyone or anything. He cannot recognize what is called the subject's allegiance. For a Christian, the promise of allegiance to any government, that very act which is regarded as the foundation of the political life, is a direct renunciation of Christianity. Because a man who unconditionally promises in advance to submit to laws which are made and will be made by men, by this very promise in a very definite manner renounces Christianity, which consists in this, that in all problems of life he is to submit only to the divine law of love, of which he is conscious in himself. It was possible with the pagan world conception to promise to do the will of the civil authorities without violating the will of God, which consisted in circumcision, the Sabbath, praying at set times, abstaining from a certain kind of food, and so forth. One did not contradict the other. But the Christian profession differs in this very thing from the pagan, in that it does not demand of a man certain external negative acts, but places him in another relation to man from what he was in before, a relation from which may result the most varied acts, which cannot be ascertained in advance, and so a Christian cannot promise to do another person's will without knowing in what the demands of this will may consist, and cannot obey the variable human laws. He cannot even promise to do anything definite at a certain time or to abstain from anything at a certain time, because he cannot know what at any time that Christian law of love, the submission to which forms the meaning of his life, may demand of him. In promising in advance unconditionally to fulfill the laws of men, a Christian would by this very promise indicate that the inner law of God does not form for him the only law of his life. For a Christian to promise that he will obey men or human laws is the same as for a laborer who has hired out to a master to promise at the same time that he will do everything which other men may command him to do. It is impossible to serve two masters. A Christian frees himself from human power by recognizing over himself nothing but God's power, the law of which, revealed to him by Christ, he recognizes in himself and to which alone he submits. And this liberation is not accomplished by means of a struggle, not by the destruction of existing forms of life, but only by means of the changed comprehension of life. The liberation takes place in consequence of this, in the first place, that a Christian recognizes the law of love, which was revealed to him by his teacher, as quite sufficient for human relations, and so regards all violence as superfluous and illegal. And, in the second place, that those privations, sufferings, threats of sufferings and privations with which the public man is brought to the necessity of obeying present themselves to a Christian with his different concept of life, only as inevitable conditions of existence, which he, without struggling against them by exercising violence, bears patiently, like diseases, hunger, and all other calamities, but which by no means can serve as a guide for his acts. What serves as a guide for a Christian's acts is only the divine principle that lives within him and that cannot be oppressed or directed by anything. A Christian acts according to the word of the prophecy applied to his teacher: he shall not strive, nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed shall he not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench, till he send forth judgment unto victory. Matthew 12, verse 19. 20. A Christian does not quarrel with anyone, does not attack anyone, nor use violence against one. On the contrary, he himself without murmuring bears violence, but by this very relation to violence he not only frees himself, but also the world from external power. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. John 8, verse 32. If there were any doubt as to Christianity being truth, that complete freedom, which cannot be oppressed by anything, and which a man experiences the moment he makes the Christian life conception his own, would be an undoubted proof of its truth. In their present condition, men are like bees which have just swarmed and are hanging down a limb in a cluster. The position of the bees on the limb is temporary and must inevitably be changed. They must rise and find a new home for themselves. Every one of the bees knows that and wishes to change its position and that of the others, but not one is able to do so before the others are going to do so. They cannot rise all at once because one hangs down from the other, keeping it from separating itself from the swarm, and so all continue to hang. It would seem that the bees could not get out of this state, just as it seems to worldly men who are entangled in the snare of the social world conception. But there would be no way out for the bees if each of the bees were not separately a living being endowed with wings. So there would also be no way out for men if each of them were not a separate living being endowed with the ability of acquiring the Christian concept of life. If every bee which can fly did not fly, the rest, too, would not move, and the swarm would never change its position. And as one bee need but open its wings, rise up and fly away, and after it a second, third, 10th, 100th, in order that the immovable cluster may become a freely flying swarm of bees. So one man need but understand life as Christianity teaches him to understand it, and begin to live accordingly, and a second, third, 100th, to do so after him, in order that the magic circle of the social life, from which there seemed to be no way out, be destroyed. But people think that the liberation of all men in this manner is too slow, and that it is necessary to find and use another such a means, so as to free all at once, something like what the bees would do, if, wishing to rise and fly away, they should find that it was too long for them to wait for the whole swarm to rise one after another, and should try to find a way where every individual bee would not have to unfold its wings and fly away, but the whole swarm could fly at once wherever it wanted. But that is impossible, so long as the first, second, third, 100th bee does not unfold its wings and fly. The swarm, too, will not fly away or find the new life. So long as every individual man does not make the Christian life conception his own, and does not live in accordance with it, the contradiction of the human life will not be solved, and the new form of life will not be established. One of the striking phenomena of our time is that preaching of slavery which is disseminated among the masses, not only by the governments, which need it, but also by those men who, preaching socialistic theories, imagine that they are the champions of liberty. These people preach that the improvement of life, the bringing of reality in agreement with consciousness, will not take place in consequence of personal efforts of separate men, but of itself, in consequence of a certain violent transformation of society which will be inaugurated by somebody. What is preached is that men do not have to go with their own feet whither they want and have to go, but that some kind of a floor will be put under their feet, so that, without walking, they will get whither they have to go. And so all their efforts must not be directed toward going according to one's strength whither one has to go, but toward constructing this imaginary floor while standing in one spot. In the economic relation, they preach a theory, the essence of which consists in this, that the worse it is, the better it is, that the more there shall be an accumulation of capital, and so an oppression of the laborer, the nearer will the liberation be. And so every personal effort of a man to free himself from the oppression of capital is useless. In the relation of the state, they preach that the greater the power of the state, which according to this theory has to take in the still unoccupied field of the private life, the better it will be, and that, therefore, the interference of the governments in the private life has to be invoked. In the political and international relations, they preach that the increase of the means of destruction, the increase of the armies, will lead to the necessity of disarmament by means of congresses, arbitrations, and so forth. And, strange to say, the obstinacy of men is so great that they believe in these theories, although the whole course of life, every step in advance, betrays its incorrectness. Men suffer from oppression, and to save themselves from this oppression, they are advised to invent common means for the improvement of their situation, to be applied by the authorities, while they themselves continue to submit to them. Obviously, nothing results from it but a strengthening of the power and consequently the intensification of the oppression. Not one of the errors of men removes them so much from the end which they have set for themselves as this one. In order to attain the end which they have set before themselves, men do all kinds of things, only not the one simple thing which all have to do. They invent the most cunning of ways for changing the situation which oppresses them, except the one simple one that none of them should do that which produces this situation. I was told of an incident which happened with a brave rural judge who, upon arriving at a village where the peasants had been riotous and whither the army had been called out, undertook to settle the riot in the spirit of Nicholas I, all by himself, through his personal influence. He sent for several wagon loads of switches and, collecting all the peasants in the corn kiln, locked himself up with them, and so intimidated the peasants with his shouts that they, obeying him, began at his command to flog one another. They continued flogging one another until there was found a little fool who did not submit and shouted to his companions to stop flogging one another. It was only then that the flogging stopped and the rural judge ran away from the kiln. It is this advice of the fool that the men of the social order do not know how to follow, for they flog one another without cessation, and men teach this mutual flogging as the last word of human wisdom. Indeed, can we imagine a more striking example of how men flog themselves than the humbleness with which the men of our time carry out the very obligations which are imposed upon them and which lead them into servitude, especially the military service? Men obviously enslave themselves, suffer from the slavery, and believe that it must be so, that it is all right and does not interfere with the liberation of men, which is being prepared somewhere and somehow, in spite of the ever-increasing and increasing slavery. Indeed, let us take a man of our time, whoever he be. I am not speaking of a true Christian, but of a man of the rank and file of our time, cultured or uncultured, a believer or unbeliever, rich or poor, a man of a family or a single man. Such a man of our time lives, doing his work or enjoying himself, employing the fruits of his own labor or those of others for his own sake or for the sake of those who are near to him, like any other man, despising all kinds of oppressions and privations, hostility and sufferings. The man lives peacefully. Suddenly people come to him who say, "In the first place, promise and swear to us that you will slavishly obey us in everything which we shall prescribe to you, and that everything we shall invent, determine, and call a law you will consider an indubitable truth and will submit to. In the second place, give part of your earnings into our keeping. We shall use this money for keeping you in slavery and preventing you from forcibly opposing our decrees. In the third place, choose yourself and others as imaginary participants in the government, knowing full well that the government will take place entirely independently of those stupid speeches which you will utter to your like, and that it will take place according to our will. In whose hands is the army? In the fourth place, appear at a set time in court and take part in all those senseless cruelties which we commit against the erring men, whom we ourselves have corrupted, in the shape of imprisonments, exiles, solitary confinements, and capital punishments. And finally, in the fifth place, besides all this, though you may be in the most friendly relations with people belonging to other nations, be prepared at once, when we command you to consider such of these men as we shall point out to you your enemies, and to cooperate personally or by hiring others in the ruin, pillage, and murder of their men, women, children, old people, and perhaps your own countrymen, even your parents, if we want it. What could any man of our time who is not stupefied answer to such demands? Why should I do all this? Every spiritually healthy man, we should think, ought to say, why should I promise to do all that which I am commanded to do, today by Salisbury, tomorrow by Gladstone, today by Boulanger, tomorrow by a chamber of just such Boulangers, today by Peter III, tomorrow by Catherine, day after tomorrow by Pugachev, today by the crazy king of Bavaria, tomorrow by Wilhelm? Why should I promise to obey them, since I know them to be bad or trifling men, or do not know them at all? Why should I, in the shape of taxes, give them the fruits of my labors, knowing that the money will be used for bribing the officials, for prisons, churches, armies, for bad things, and my own enslavement? Why should I flog myself? Why should I go, losing my time and pulling the wool over my eyes and ascribing to the violators a semblance of legality, and take part in the government, when I know full well that the government of the state is in the hands of those in whose hands is the army? Why should I go into courts and take part in the torture and punishments of men for having erred, since I know, if I am a Christian, that the law of revenge has given way to the law of love, and, if I am a cultured man, that punishments do not make men who are subjected to them better, but worse? And why should I, above all, simply because the keys of the temple at Jerusalem will be in the hands of this bishop and not of that, because in Bulgaria this and not that German will be prince, and because English and not American merchants will catch seals, recognize as enemies the men of a neighboring nation with whom I have heretofore lived at peace and wish to live in love and concord? And why should I hire soldiers or myself go and kill and destroy them, and myself be subjected to their attack? And why, above all else, should I cooperate personally or by the hiring of a military force in the enslavement and murder of my own brothers and fathers? Why should I flog myself? All this I do not need, and all this is harmful for me, and all this on all sides of me is immoral, abominable. So why should I do it all? If you tell me that without it I shall fare ill at somebody's hands, I, in the first place, do not foresee anything so bad as that which you cause me if I listen to you. In the second place, it is quite clear to me that, if you do not flog yourself, nobody is going to flog us. The government is the kings, the ministers, the officials with their pens, who cannot compel me to do anything like what the rural judge compelled the peasants to do, those who will take me forcibly to court, to prison. To the execution are not the kings and the officials with their pens, but those very people who are in the same condition in which I am. It is just as useless and harmful and disagreeable for them to be flogged as it is for me, and so in all probability, if I open their eyes, they not only must do me no violence, but must even do as I do. In the third place, even if it should happen that I must suffer for it, it still is more advantageous for me to be exiled or shut up in a prison while defending common sense and the good, which shall triumph, if not today, certainly tomorrow or in a very short time, than to suffer for a foolish thing and an evil, which sooner or later must come to an end. And so it is even in this case more advantageous for me to risk being deported, locked up in a prison, or even executed, than through my own fault to pass my whole life as a slave to other bad men, than to be ruined by an enemy making an incursion and stupidly to be maimed or killed by him while defending a cannon, or a useless piece of land, or a stupid rag which they call a flag. I do not want to flog myself, and I won't. There is no reason why I should. Do it yourselves if you are so minded, but I won't. It would seem that not only the religious or moral feeling, but the simplest reflection and calculation would make a man of our time answer and act in this manner. But no, the men of the social life conception find that it is not right to act in this manner, and that it is even harmful to act thus if we wish to obtain the end of the liberation of men from slavery, and that it is necessary for us, as in the case of the rural judge and the peasants, to continue to flog one another, consoling ourselves with the thought that the fact that we prattle in chambers and assemblies, form labor unions, parade the streets on the 1st of May, form plots, and secretly tease the government which flogs us that all this will have the effect of freeing us very soon, though we are enslaving ourselves more and more. Nothing so much impedes the liberation of men as this remarkable delusion. Instead of directing all his forces to the liberation of himself, to the change of his world conception, every man seeks for an external aggregate means for freeing himself, and thus fetters himself more and more. It is as though men should affirm that, in order to fan a fire, it is not necessary to make every coal catch fire, but to place the coals in a certain order. In the meantime, it has been getting more and more obvious of late that the liberation of all men will take place only through the liberation of the individual men. The liberation of individual persons in the name of the Christian life conception from the enslavement of the state, which used to be an exclusive and imperceptible phenomenon, has of late received a significance which is menacing to the power of state. If formerly, in the days of Rome, in the Middle Ages, it happened that a Christian, professing his teaching, refused to take part in sacrifices, to worship the emperors and gods, or in the Middle Ages refused to worship the icons. To recognize the papal power, these refusals were, in the first place, accidental. A man might have been put to the necessity of professing his faith, and he might have lived a life without being placed in this necessity. But now all men without exception are subject to these trials. Every man of our time is put to the necessity of recognizing his participation in the cruelties of the pagan life, or rejecting it. And, in the second place, in those days the refusals to worship the gods, the icons, the Pope, did not present any essential phenomena for the state. No matter how many men worshiped the gods, the icons, or the Pope, the state remained as strong as ever. But now the refusal to comply with the non-Christian demands of governments undermines the power of state to the root, because all the power of the state is based on these non-Christian demands. The worldly powers were led by the course of life to the proposition that for their own preservation they had to demand from all men such acts as could not be performed by those who profess true Christianity. And so in our time, every profession of true Christianity by a separate individual most materially undermines the power of the government and inevitably leads to the emancipation of all men. What importance can there be in such phenomena as the refusals of a few dozens of madmen, as they are called, who do not wish to swear to the government or pay taxes or take part in courts and military service? These men are punished and removed, and life continues as of old. It would seem that there is nothing important in these phenomena, and yet it is these very phenomena that more than anything else undermine the power of the state and prepare the emancipation of men. They are those individual bees which begin to separate from the swarm and fly about, awaiting what cannot be delayed, the rising of the whole swarm after them. The governments know this and are afraid of these phenomena more than of all socialists, communists, anarchists, and their plots with their dynamite bombs. A new reign begins. According to the general rule and customary order, all the subjects are ordered to swear allegiance to the new government. A general order is sent out, and everybody is called to the cathedral to swear. Suddenly one man in Perm, another in Tula, a third in Moscow, a fourth in Kaluga declare that they will not swear, and they base their refusal, every one of them, without having plotted together, on one and the same reason, which is that the oath is prohibited by the Christian law, and that, even if it were not prohibited, they could not, according to the spirit of the Christian law, promise to commit the evil acts which are demanded of them in the oath, such as denouncing all those who will violate the interests of the government, defending their government with weapons in their hands, or attacking its enemies. They are summoned before the rural judges or chiefs, priests, or governors, are admonished, implored, threatened, and punished, but they stick to their determination and do not swear. Among millions of those who swear, there are a few dozens who do not. And they are asked, "So you have not sworn?" "We have not." "Well, nothing happened?" "Nothing." All the subjects of a state are obliged to pay taxes. And all pay, but one man in Kharkov, another in Tver, a third in Samara, refuse to pay their taxes, all of them repeating, as though by agreement, one and the same thing. One says that he will pay only when he is told what the money taken from him will be used for. If for good things, he says, he will himself give more than is asked of him, But if for bad things, he will not give anything voluntarily, because, according to Christ's teaching, which he follows, he cannot contribute to evil deeds. The same, though with different words, is said by the others, who do not voluntarily pay their taxes. From those who possess anything, the property is taken by force, but those who have nothing to give are left alone. Well, you did not pay the taxes? I did not. Well, and nothing happened to you? Nothing. Passports are established. All who remove themselves from their place of abode are obliged to take them and pay a revenue for them. Suddenly on all sides appear men who say that it is not necessary to take passports and that it is not right to recognize one's dependence on a government which lives by violence, and they take no passports and pay no revenue. Again, it is impossible to make these people carry out what is demanded of them. They are locked up in prisons and let out again, and they continue to live without passports. All the peasants are obliged to serve as 100 men, 10 men, and so forth. Suddenly, a peasant refuses in Kharkov to perform this office, explaining his refusal by this, that, according to the Christian law which he professes, he cannot bind, lock up, and lead a man from one place to another. The same is asserted by a peasant in Tver in Tambov. The peasants are cursed, beaten, locked up, but they stick to their determination and do not do what is contrary to their faith. And they are no longer chosen as 100 men, and that is the end of it. All the citizens must take part in court proceedings in the capacity of jurymen. Suddenly, the greatest variety of men, wheelwrights, professors, merchants, peasants, gentlemen, as though by agreement, all refuse to serve, not for causes which are recognized by the law, but because the court itself, according to their conviction, is an illegal, non-Christian thing which ought not to exist. These men are fined, without being allowed publicly to express the motives of their refusal, and others are put in their places. The same is done to those who on the same grounds refuse to be witnesses at court. And nothing more happens. All men of 21 years of age are obliged to draw lots. Suddenly one young man in Moscow, another in Tver, a third in Kharkov, a fourth in Kiev, appear, as though by previous agreement, in court, and declare that they will neither swear nor serve, because they are Christians. Here are the details of one of the first cases. Since then these refusals have become more and more frequent, with which I am acquainted. Point 27, in all the other cases approximately the same was done. A young man of medium culture refuses in the Moscow council to serve. No attention is paid to his words, and he is ordered to pronounce the words of the oath, just like the rest. He refuses, pointing out the definite place in the gospel where taking an oath is prohibited. No attention is paid to his arguments, and they demand that he fulfill their command, but he does not do so. Then it is assumed that he is a sectarian and so understands Christianity incorrectly, that is, not in the way the clergy and the government pay understand it, and so the young man is sent under convoy to the priests to be admonished. The priests begin to admonish the young man, but their admonitions in the name of Christ to renounce Christ have apparently no effect upon the young man, and he is sent back to the army, having been declared incorrigible. The young man still refuses to take the oath and openly declines to fulfill his military duties. This case is not provided for in the laws. It is impossible to admit a refusal to do the will of the authorities, and it is equally impossible to rate this as a case of simple disobedience. In a consultation, the military authorities determined to get rid of the troublesome young man by declaring him to be a revolutionist and send him under guard into the office of the secret police. The police and the gendarmes examine the young man, but nothing of what he says fits in with the crimes dealt with in their departments, and there is absolutely no way of accusing him of revolutionary acts or of plotting, since he declares that he does not wish to destroy anything, but, on the contrary, rejects all violence and conceals nothing, but seeks an opportunity for saying and doing in a most open manner what he says and does. And the gendarmes, though no laws are binding on them, like the clergy, find no cause for an accusation and return the young man to the army. Again the chiefs confer and decide to enlist the young man in the army, though he refuses to take the oath. He is dressed up, entered on the lists, and sent under guard to the place where the troops are distributed. Here the chief of the section into which he enters again demands of the young man the fulfillment of military duties, and he again refuses to obey, and in the presence of other soldiers gives the cause for his refusal, saying that, as a Christian, he cannot voluntarily prepare himself to commit murder, which was prohibited even by the laws of Moses. The case takes place in a provincial city. It evokes interest and even sympathy, not only among outsiders, but also among officers, and so the superiors do not dare to apply the usual disciplinary measures for a refusal to serve. However, for decency's sake, the young man is locked up in prison, and an inquiry is sent to the higher military authority, requesting it to say what is to be done. From the official point of view, a refusal to take part in military service, in which the Tsar himself serves and which is blessed by the Church, presents itself as madness, and so they write from St. Petersburg that, since the young man is, no doubt, out of his mind, no severe measures are to be used against him, but he is to be sent to an insane asylum where his mental health is to be investigated and he is to be cured. He is sent there in the hope that he will stay there, just as happened 10 years before with another young man who in turn refused to do military service and who was tortured in an insane asylum until he gave in. But even this measure does not save the military authorities from the inconvenient young man. The doctors examine him, are very much interested in him, and, finding in him no symptoms whatever of any mental trouble, naturally return him to the army. He is received, and, pretending that his refusal and motives are forgotten, they again propose to him that he go to the exercises, but he again, in the presence of other soldiers, refuses and gives the cause for his refusal. This case more and more attracts the attention of the soldiers and the inhabitants of the town. Again they write to St. Petersburg, and from there comes the decision that the young man be transferred to the army at the frontier, where it is in a state of siege, and where he may be shot for refusing to serve, and where the matter may pass unnoticed. Since in that distant country there are few Russians and Christians, and mostly natives and Mohammedans. And so they do. The young man is attached to the troops located in the Trans-Caspian territory, and with criminals he is dispatched to a chief who is known for his determination and severity. During all this time, with all these transportations from one place to another, the young man is treated rudely. He is kept cold, hungry, and dirty, and his life in general is made a burden for him. But all these tortures do not make him change his determination. In the Trans-Caspian territory, when told to stand sentry with his gun, he again refuses to obey. He does not refuse to go and stand near some haystacks, whither he is sent, but he refuses to take his gun, declaring that under no condition would he use violence against anyone. All this takes place in the presence of other soldiers. It is impossible to let such a case go unpunished, and the young man is tried for violation of discipline. The trial takes place, and the young man is sentenced to incarceration in a military prison for 2 years. He is again sent by tapes with other criminals to the Caucasus and is shut up in a prison, where he falls a prey to the uncontrolled power of the jailer. There he is tormented for 1 year and 6 months, but he still refuses to change his decision about taking up arms, and he explains to all those with whom he comes in contact why he does not do so. And at the end of his 2nd year, he is discharged before the expiration of his term by counting, contrary to the law, his time in prison as part of his service, only to get rid of him as quickly as possible. Just like this man, as though having plotted together, act other men in various parts of Russia, and in all those cases the mode of the government's action is as timid, indefinite, and secretive. Some of these men are sent to insane asylums, others are enlisted as scribes and are transferred to service in Siberia, others are made to serve in the forestry department, others are locked up in prisons, and others are fined. Even now a few such men who have refused are sitting in prisons, not for the essential point in the case, the rejection of the legality of the government's action, but for the non-fulfillment of the private demands of the government. Thus an officer of the reserve, who did not keep the authorities informed of his residence and who declared that he would not again serve as a military man, was lately, for not fulfilling the commands of the authorities, fined 30 rubles, which, too, he refused to pay voluntarily. Thus several peasants and soldiers, who lately refused to take part in military exercises and take up arms, were locked up for disobedience and contempt. And such cases of refusing to comply with the government demands which are contrary to Christianity, especially refusals to do military service, have of late occurred not in Russia alone, but even elsewhere. Thus, I know that in Serbia men of the so-called sect of Nazarenes constantly refuse to do military service, and the Austrian government has for several years been vainly struggling with them, subjecting them to imprisonment. In the year 1885, there were 130 such refusals. In Switzerland, I know men were incarcerated in the Chillon fortress in the year 1890 for refusing to do military service, and they did not change their determination in consequence of their imprisonment. Such refusals have also happened in Prussia. I know of an under-officer of the Guard who in 1891 declared to the authorities in Berlin that as a Christian he would not continue to serve, and, in spite of all admonitions, threats, and punishments, he stuck to his decision. In France, there has of late arisen in the south a community of men who bear the name of Hinchists. This information is received from the Peace Herald, July 1891. The members of which on the basis of the Christian profession refused to do military service, and at first were inscribed in hospitals, but now, having increased in numbers, are subjected to punishments for disobedience, but still refuse to take up arms. The socialists, communists, anarchists, with their bombs, riots, and revolutions, are by no means so terrible to the governments as these scattered people, who from various sides refuse to do military service. All of them on the basis of the same well-known teaching. Every government knows how and why to defend itself against revolutionists, and they have means for it, and so are not afraid of these external enemies. But what are the governments to do against those men who point out the uselessness, superfluity, and harmfulness of all governments, and do not struggle with them, but only have no use for them, get along without them, and do not wish to take part in them? The revolutionists say, the governmental structure is bad for this and that reason. It is necessary to put this or that in its place. But a Christian says, I know nothing of the governmental structure, about its being good or bad, and do not wish to destroy it for the very reason that I do not know whether it is good or bad, but for the same reason I do not wish to sustain it. I not only do not wish to, but even cannot do so, because what is demanded of me is contrary to my conscience. What is contrary to a Christian's conscience is all obligations of state, the oath, the taxes, the courts, the army. But on all these obligations the state is founded. The revolutionary enemies struggle with the state from without, but Christianity does not struggle at all. It inwardly destroys all the foundations of government. Among the Russian people, where, especially since the time of Peter I, the protest of Christianity against the government has never ceased, where the structure of life is such that men have gone away by whole communities to Turkey, to China, to uninhabitable lands, and not only are in no need of the government, but always look upon it as an unnecessary burden and only bear it as a calamity, be it Turkish, Russian, or Chinese. Among the Russian people there have of late been occurring more frequently cases of the Christian conscious emancipation of separate individuals from submission to the government. And now especially these manifestations are very terrible to the government, because those who refuse frequently do not belong to the so-called lower uncultured classes, but to the people with a medium or higher education. And because these men no longer base their refusals on some mystical exclusive beliefs, as was the case formerly, nor connect them with some superstition or savage practices, as is the case with the self-immolators and runners. 28, but put forth the simplest and clearest truths, which are accessible to all men and recognized by them all. Thus they refuse to pay their taxes voluntarily, because the taxes are used for acts of violence, for salaries to violators and military men, for the construction of prisons, fortresses, cannon, while they, as Christians, consider it sinful and immoral to take part in these things. Those who refuse to take the common oath do so because to promise to obey the authorities, that is, men who are given to acts of violence, is contrary to the Christian teaching. They refuse to take their oath in courts, because the oath is directly forbidden in the gospel. They decline to serve in the police, because in connection with these duties they have to use force against their own brothers and torment them, whereas a Christian may not do so. They decline to take part in court proceedings because they consider every court proceeding a fulfillment of the law of revenge, which is incompatible with the Christian law of forgiveness and love. They decline to take part in all military preparations and in the army because they do not wish to be and cannot be executioners and do not want to prepare themselves for the office of executioner. All the motives of these refusals are such that, no matter how despotic a government may be, it cannot punish them openly. To punish them for such refusals, a government must itself irretrievably renounce reason and the good, whereas it assures men that it serves only in the name of reason and of the good. What are the governments to do against these men? Indeed, the governments can kill off, forever shut up in prisons and at hard labor their enemies, who wish by the exercise of violence to overthrow them. They can bury in gold half of the men, such as they may need, and bribe them. They can subject to themselves millions of armed men who will be ready to destroy all the enemies of the governments. But what can they do with men who, not wishing to destroy anything, nor to establish anything, wish only for their own sakes, for the sake of their lives, to do nothing which is contrary to the Christian law, and so refuse to fulfill the most common obligations, which are most indispensable to the governments? If they were revolutionists who preach violence and murder and who practice all these things, it would be easy to oppose them. Part of them would be bribed, part deceived, part frightened into subjection, and those who could not be bribed or deceived or frightened would be declared malefactors and enemies of society, would be executed or locked up, and the crowd would applaud the action of the government. If they were some horrible sectarians who preached a peculiar faith, it would be possible, thanks to those superstitions of falsehood, which by them are mixed in with their doctrine, to overthrow whatever truth there is in their faith. But what is to be done with men who preach neither revolution, nor any special religious dogmas, but only, because they do not wish to harm anyone, refuse to take the oath of allegiance, to pay taxes, to take part in court proceedings, in military service, and in duties on which the whole structure of the government is based? What is to be done with such men? It is impossible to bribe them. The very risk which they take shows their unselfishness. Nor can they be deceived by claiming that God wants it so, because their refusal is based on the explicit, undoubted law of God, which is professed by the very men who wish to make them act contrary to it. Still less is it possible to intimidate them with threats, because the privations and sufferings to which they are subjected for their faith only strengthen their desire, and because it says distinctly in their law that God must be obeyed more than men, and that they should not fear those who may ruin their bodies, but that which may ruin both their bodies and their souls. Nor can they be executed or locked up forever. These men have a past and friends, and their manner of thinking and acting is known. All know them as meek, good, peaceful men, and it is impossible to declare them to be malefactors who ought to be removed for the safety of society. The execution of men who by all men are recognized to be good will only call forth defenders of the refusal and commentators on it, and the causes of the refusal need but be made clear, in order that it may become clear to all men that the causes which make these Christians refuse to comply with the demands of the state are the same for all other men, and that all men ought to have done so long ago. In the presence of the refusals of the Christians, the governments are in a desperate plight. They see that the prophecy of Christianity is being fulfilled. It tears asunder the fetters of the fettered and sets free the men who lived in slavery, and they see that this liberation will inevitably destroy those who keep others in slavery. The governments see this. They know that their hours are numbered and are unable to do anything. All they can do for their salvation is to defer the hour of their ruin. This they do, but their situation is none the less desperate. The situation of the governments is like the situation of a conqueror who wants to save the city that is fired by its own inhabitants. He no sooner puts out the fire in one place than it begins to burn in 2 other places. He no sooner gives way to the fire and breaks off what is burning in a large building than even this building begins to burn from 2 sides. These individual fires are still rare, but having started with a spark, they will not stop until everything is consumed. And just as the governments find themselves in such unprotected straits in the presence of men who profess Christianity, and when but very little is wanting for this force, which seems so powerful and which was reared through so many centuries, to fall to pieces. The public leaders preach that it is not only unnecessary, but even harmful and immoral for every individual to try and free himself from slavery. It is as though some people, to free a dammed-up river, should have all but cut through a ditch, when nothing but an opening is necessary for the water to flow into this ditch and do the rest, and there should appear some people who would persuade them that, rather than let off the water, they should construct above the river a machine with buckets, which, drawing the water up on one side, would drop it into the same river from the other side. But the matter has gone too far. The governments feel their indefensibleness and weakness, and the men of the Christian consciousness are awakening from their lethargy and are beginning to feel their strength. "I brought the fire upon earth," said Christ, "and how I long for it to burn up." And this fire is beginning to burn up. Chapter 10. Christianity in its true meaning destroys the state. Thus it was understood from the very beginning, and Christ was crucified for this very reason, and thus it has always been understood by men who are not fettered by the necessity of proving the justification of the Christian state. Only when the heads of the states accepted the external nominal Christianity did they begin to invent all those impossible finely spun theories, according to which Christianity was compatible with the state. But for every sincere and serious man of our time, it is quite obvious that true Christianity, the teaching of humility, of forgiveness of offenses, of love, is incompatible with the state, with its magnificence, its violence, its executions, and its wars. The profession of true Christianity not only excludes the possibility of recognizing the state, but even destroys its very foundations. But if this is so, and it is true that Christianity is incompatible with the state, there naturally arises the question, what is more necessary for the good of humanity? What more permanently secures the good of men, the political form of life, or its destruction and the substitution of Christianity in its place? Some men say that the state is most necessary for humanity, that the destruction of the political form would lead to the destruction of everything worked out by humanity, that the state has been and continues to be the only form of the development of humanity, and that all that evil which we see among the nations who live in the political form is not due to this form, but to the abuses, which can be mended without destruction, and that humanity, without impairing the political form, can develop and reach a high degree of well-being. And the men who think so adduce in confirmation of their opinion philosophic, historic, and even religious arguments, which to them seem incontrovertible. But there are men who assume the opposite, namely, that as there was a time when humanity lived without a political form, this form is only temporary, and the time must arrive when men shall need a new form, and that this time has arrived even now. And the men who think so also adduce in confirmation of their opinion philosophic and historic and religious arguments, which also seem incontrovertible to them. It is possible to write volumes in the defense of the first opinion. They have been written long ago, and there is still no end to them, and there can be written much against it, though but lately begun. Many a brilliant thing has been written against it. It is impossible to prove, as the defenders of the state claim, that the destruction of the state will lead to a social chaos, mutual rapine, murder, and the destruction of all public institutions, and the return of humanity to barbarism. Nor can it be proved, as the opponents of the state claim, that men have already become so wise and good that they do not rob or kill one another, that they prefer peace to hostility, that they will themselves, without the aid of the state, arrange everything they need, and that therefore the state not only does not contribute to all this, but, on the contrary, under the guise of defending men, exerts a harmful and bestializing influence upon them. It is impossible to prove either the one or the other by means of abstract reflections. Still less can it be proved by experience, since the question consists in this, whether the experiment is to be made or not. The question as to whether the time has come for abolishing the state or not would be insoluble if there did not exist another vital method for an incontestable solution of the same. Quite independently of anybody's reflections as to whether the chicks are sufficiently matured for him to drive the hen away from the nest and let the chicks out of their eggs, or whether they are not yet sufficiently matured, the incontestable judges of the case will be the chicks themselves, when, unable to find enough room in their eggs, they will begin to pick them with their bills and will themselves come out of them. The same is true of the question whether the time for destroying the political form and for substituting another form has come or not. If a man, in consequence of the higher consciousness matured in him, is no longer able to comply with the demands of the state, no longer finds room in it, and at the same time no longer is in need of the preservation of the political form, the question as to whether men have matured for the change of the political form or not is decided from an entirely different side, and just as incontestably as for the chick that has picked its shell, into which no power in the world can again return it, by the men themselves who have outgrown the state and who cannot be returned to it by any power in the world. It is very likely that the state was necessary and even now is necessary for all those purposes which you ascribe to it, says the man who has made the Christian life conception his own. But all I know is that, on the one hand, I no longer need the state, and, on the other, I can no longer perform those acts which are necessary for the existence of the state. Arrange for yourselves what you need for your lives. I cannot prove either the common necessity or the common harm of the state. All I know is what I need and what not, what I may do and what not. I know for myself that I do not need any separation from the other nations, and so I cannot recognize my exclusive belonging to some one nation or state and my subjection to any government. I know in my own case that I do not need all those government offices and courts, which are the product of violence, and so I cannot take part in any of them. I know in my own case that I do not need to attack other nations and kill them, nor defend myself by taking up arms, and so I cannot take part in wars and in preparations for them. It is very likely that there are some people who cannot regard all that as necessary and indispensable. I cannot dispute with them all I know concerning myself, but that I know incontestably is that I do not need it all and am not able to do it. I do not need it, and I cannot do it, not because I, my personality, do not want it, but because he who has sent me into life and has given me the incontestable law for guidance in my life does not want it. No matter what arguments men may adduce in proof of the danger of abolishing the power of the state and that this abolition may beget calamities, the men who have outgrown the political form can no longer find their place in it. And no matter what arguments may be adduced to a man who has outgrown the political form about its indispensableness, he cannot return to it, cannot take part in the affairs which are denied by his consciousness, just as the full-grown chicks can no longer return into the shell which they have outgrown. But even if this is so, say the defenders of the existing order, the abolition of the violence of state would be possible and desirable only if all men became Christians. So long as this is not the case, so long as among men who only call themselves Christians there are men who are no Christians, evil men, who for the sake of their personal lust are prepared to do harm to others, the abolition of the power of state would not only fail to be a good for all the rest, but would even increase their wretchedness. The abolition of the political form of life is undesirable, not only when there is a small proportion of true Christians, but even when all shall be Christians, while in their midst or all about them, among other nations, there shall remain non-Christians. Because the non-Christians will with impunity rob, violate, kill the Christians, and make their life miserable. What will happen will be that the evil men will with impunity rule the good and do violence to them. And so the power of state must not be abolished until all the bad, rapacious men in the world are destroyed. And as this will not happen for a long time to come, if at all, this power, in spite of the attempts of individual Christians at emancipating themselves from the power of state, must be maintained for the sake of the majority of men. Thus speak the defenders of the state. Without the state, the evil men do violence to the good and rule over them, but the power of state makes it possible for the good to keep the evil in check, they say. But, in asserting this, the defenders of the existing order of things decide in advance the justice of the position which it is for them to prove. In saying that without the power of state the evil men would rule over the good, they take it for granted that the good are precisely those who at the present time have power, and the bad the same who are now subjugated. But it is precisely this that has to be proved. This would be true only if in our world took place what really does not take place, but is supposed to take place, in China, namely, that the good are always in power and that, As soon as at the helm of the government stand men who are not better than those over whom they rule, the citizens are obliged to depose them. Thus it is supposed to be in China, but in reality this is not so, and cannot be so, because in order to overthrow the power of the violating government, it is not enough to have the right to do so, one must also have the force. Consequently, this is only assumed to be so even in China, but in our Christian world this has never even been assumed. In our world, there is not even any foundation for assuming that better men or the best should rule, and not those who have seized the power and retain it for themselves and for their descendants. Better men are absolutely unable to seize the power and to retain it. In order to get the power and retain it, it is necessary to love power, but love of power is not connected with goodness, but with qualities which are the opposite of goodness, such as pride, cunning, cruelty. Without self-aggrandizement and debasement of others, without hypocrisy, deceit, prisons, fortresses, executions, murders, a power can neither arise nor maintain itself. If the power of state be abolished, the more evil men will rule over the less evil ones, say the defenders of the state. But if the Egyptians subjugated the Jews, the Persians the Egyptians, the Macedonians the Persians, the Romans the Greeks, the barbarians the Romans, is it possible that all those who have subjugated were better than those whom they subjugated? And similarly, in the transference of the power in one state from one set of persons to another, has the power always passed into the hands of those who were better? When Louis XV was deposed and Robespierre and later Napoleon ruled, who did rule? Better or worse men? And when did better men rule? When men from Versailles or from the Commune were in power? Or when Charles I or Cromwell was at the head of the government? Or when Peter III was Tsar or when he was killed, and the sovereign was Catherine for one part of Russia and Pugachev for the other? Who was then evil and who good? All men in power assert that their power is necessary in order that the evil men may not do violence to the good, meaning by this that they are those same good men who protect others against the evil men. But to rule means to do violence, and to do violence means to do what the other man, on whom the violence is exerted, does not wish to have done to him, and what, no doubt, he who exerts the violence would not wish to have done to himself. Consequently, to rule means to do to another what we do not wish to have done to ourselves, that is, to do evil. To submit means to prefer suffering to violence. But to prefer suffering to violence means to be good, or at least less evil than those who do to another what they do not wish to have done to themselves. And so all the probabilities are in favor of the fact that not those who are better than those over whom they rule, but, on the contrary, those who are worse, have always been and even now are in power. There may also be worse men among those who submit to the power, but it cannot be that better men should rule over worse men. This was impossible to assume in case of the pagan inexact definition of goodness, but with the Christian lucid and exact definition of goodness and evil, it is impossible to think so. If more or less good men, more or less bad men, cannot be distinguished in the pagan world, the Christian conception of good and evil has so clearly defined the symptoms of the good and the evil that they can no longer be mistaken. According to Christ's teaching, the good are those who humble themselves, suffer, do not resist evil with force, forgive offenses, love their enemies. The evil are those who exalt themselves, rule, struggle, and do violence to people, and so. According to Christ's teaching, there is no doubt as to where the good are among the ruling and the subjugated. It even sounds ridiculous to speak of ruling Christians. The non-Christians, that is, those who base their lives on the worldly good, must always rule over Christians, over those who assume that their lives consist in the renunciation of this good. Thus it has always been, and it has become more and more definite in proportion as the Christian teaching has been disseminated and elucidated. The more the true Christianity spread and entered into the consciousness of men, the less it was possible for Christians to be among the rulers, and the easier it grew for non-Christians to rule over Christians. The abolition of the violence of state at a time when not all men in society have become true Christians would have this effect, that the bad would rule over the good and would with impunity do violence to them, say the defenders of the existing order of life. The bad will rule over the good and will do violence to them. but it has never been different, and it never can be. Thus it has always been since the beginning of the world, and thus it is now. The bad always rule over the good and always do violence to them. Cain did violence to Abel, cunning Jacob to trustful Esau, deceitful Laban to Jacob. Caiaphas and Pilate ruled over Christ. The Roman emperors ruled over a Seneca, an Epictetus, and good Romans who lived in their time. Ivan IV with his oprichniks, the drunken syphilitic Peter with his fools, the harlot Catherine with her lovers, ruled over the industrious religious Russians of their time and did violence to them. Wilhelm rules over the Germans, Stambulov over the Bulgarians, Russian officials over the Russian people. The Germans ruled over the Italians, now they rule over Hungarians and Slavs. The Turks have ruled over Greeks and Slavs. The English rule over Hindus. The Mongolians rule over the Chinese. Thus, whether the political violence be abolished or not, the condition of the good men who are violated by the bad will not be changed thereby. It is absolutely impossible to frighten men with this, that the bad will rule over the good, because what they are frightened with is precisely what has always been and cannot be otherwise. The whole pagan history of humanity consists of only those cases when the worse seized the power over the less bad, and, having seized it, maintained it by cruelties and cunning, and, proclaiming themselves as guardians of justice and defenders of the good against the bad, ruled over the good. As to the rulers saying that, if it were not for their power, the worse would do violence to the good, it means only this, that the violators in power do not wish to cede this power to other violators, who may wish to take it from them. But, in saying this, the rulers only give themselves away. They say that their power, that is, violence, is necessary for the defense of men against some other violators, or such as may still appear. Point 29. The exercise of violence is dangerous for the very reason that, as soon as it is exercised, all the arguments adduced by the violators can, not only with the same, but even with greater force, be applied against them. They speak of the past, and more frequently of the imaginary future of violence, but themselves without cessation commit acts of violence. You say that men used to rob and kill others, and you are afraid that men will rob and kill one another if your power does not exist. That may be so or not, but you're ruining thousands of men in prisons, at hard labor, in fortresses, in exile. You're ruining millions of families with your militarism, and destroying millions of people physically and morally is not imaginary, but real violence against which, according to your own statement, people ought to fight by exercising violence. Consequently, those evil men, against whom, according to your own reflection, it is absolutely necessary to exercise violence, are you yourselves, is what the violated ought to say to the violators. And the non-Christians have always spoken and thought and acted in this manner. If the violated are worse than those who exercise violence, they attack them and try to overthrow them, and, under favorable conditions, do overthrow them, or, what is most usual, enter the ranks of the violators and take part in their acts of violence. Thus the very thing with which the defenders of the state frighten men, that, if there did not exist of violating power, the bad would be ruling over the good, is what without cessation has been accomplished in the life of humanity. And so the abolition of political violence can in no case be the cause of the increase of the violence of the bad over the good. When the violence of the government is destroyed, acts of violence will, probably, be committed by other men than before, but the sum of the violence will in no case be increased, simply because the power will pass from the hands of one set of men into those of another. The violence of state will be stopped only when the bad men in society shall be destroyed, say the defenders of the existing order, meaning by this that, since there will always be bad men, violence will never come to a stop. That would be true only if what they assume actually existed, namely, that the violators are better, and that the only means for the emancipation of men from evil is violence. In that case, violence could, indeed, never be stopped. But as this is not the case, and the very opposite is true, namely, that it is not the better men who exercise violence against the bad, but the bad who do violence to the good, and that outside of violence, which never puts a stop to evil, there is another means for the abolition of violence. The assertion that violence will never stop is not correct. Violence grows less and must evidently stop, but not, as the defenders of the existing order imagine. Because men who are subject to violence will, in consequence of the influence exerted upon them by the governments, become better and better. In consequence of this, they will, on the contrary, always become worse, but because. Since all men are constantly growing better and better, even the worst men in power, growing less and less evil, will become sufficiently good to be incapable of exercising violence. The forward movement of humanity takes place, not in this way, that the best elements of society, seizing the power and using violence against those men who are in their power, make them better, as the conservatives and revolutionists think, but in the first and chief place, in that all men in general unswervingly and without cessation more and more consciously acquire the Christian life conception, and in the second place, in that, even independently of the conscious spiritual activity of men unconsciously, in consequence of the very process of seizure of power by one set of men and transference to another set, and involuntarily are brought to a more Christian relation to life. This process takes place in the following manner: the worst elements of society, having seized the power and being in possession of it, under the influence of the sobering quality which always accompanies it, become less and less cruel and less able to make use of the cruel forms of violence, and, in consequence of this, give place to others, in whom again goes on the process of softening and, so to speak, unconscious Christianization. What takes place in men is something like the process of boiling. All the men of the majority of the non-Christian life conception strive after power and struggle to obtain it. In this struggle, the most cruel and coarse and the least Christian elements of society, by doing violence to the meeker, more Christian people, who are more sensible to the good, rise to the higher strata of society. And here with the men in this condition there takes place what Christ predicted, saying, "Woe unto you that are rich, that are full now, and when all are glorified." What happens is that men in power, who are in possession of the consequences of power, of glory and wealth, having reached certain different aims, which they have set to themselves in their desires, recognize their vanity and return to the position which they left. Charles V, Ivan IV, Alexander I, having recognized all the vanity and evil of power, renounced it, because they saw all its evil and were no longer able calmly to make use of violence as of a good deed, as they had done before. But it is not only a Charles and an Alexander who travel on this road and recognize the vanity and evil of power. Through this unconscious process of softening of manners passes every man who has acquired the power toward which he has been striving. Not only every minister, general, millionaire, merchant, but also every head of an office who has obtained the place he has been 10 years waiting for, every well-to-do peasant who is laid by 100 or 200 rubles. Through this process pass not only separate individuals, but also aggregates of men, whole nations. The temptations of power and of everything which it gives, of wealth, honors, luxurious life, present themselves as a worthy aim for the activity of men only so long as the power is not attained, but the moment a man attains it, they reveal their emptiness and slowly lose their force of attraction, like clouds, which have form and beauty only from a distance. One needs but enter them, in order that that which seemed beautiful in them should disappear. Men who have attained power and wealth, frequently the very men who have gained them, more frequently their descendants, stop being so anxious for power and so cruel in attaining it. Having through experience, under the influence of Christianity, learned the vanity of the fruits of violence, men, at times in one, at others in a few generations, lose those vices which are evoked by the passion for power and wealth, and, becoming less cruel, do not hold their position, and are pushed out of power by other, less Christian, more evil men, and return to strata of society lower in position, but higher in morality, increasing the average of the Christian consciousness of all men. But immediately after them other, worse, coarser, less Christian elements of society rise to the top, again are subjected to the same process as their predecessors, and again in one or a few generations. having experienced the vanity of the fruits of violence and being permeated by Christianity, descend to the level of the violated, and again make place for new, less coarse violators than the preceding ones, but coarser than those whom they oppress. Thus, despite the fact that the power remains externally the same that it was, there is with every change of men in power a greater increase in the number of men who by experience are brought to the necessity of accepting the Christian life conception. And with every change the coarsest, most cruel, and least Christian of all enter into the possession of the power, but they are such as are constantly less coarse and cruel and more Christian than their predecessors. Violence selects and attracts the worst elements of society, works them over, and, improving and softening them, returns them to society. Such is the process by means of which Christianity, in spite of the violence which is exercised by the power of the state and which impedes the forward movement of humanity, takes possession of men more and more. Christianity is penetrating into the consciousness of men, not only despite the violence exerted by the power, but even by means of it. And thus the assertion of the defenders of the political structure that, if the violence of the state be abolished, the evil men will rule over the good, not only does not prove that this, the ruling of the bad over the good, is dangerous, for it is precisely what is taking place now, but, on the contrary, proves that the violence of the state, which gives the bad a chance to rule over the good, is the very evil which it is desirable to destroy, and which is continuously destroyed by life itself. But even if it were true that the violence of the state will come to an end when those who are in power shall become Christian enough to renounce the power of their own choice, and there shall no longer be found any men who are prepared to take their places, and if it is true that this process is taking place, say the defenders of the existing order, when will that be? If 1800 years have passed and there are still so many volunteers who are ready to rule, and so few who are ready to submit, there is no probability that this will happen very soon or ever at all. If there are, as there have been among all men, such as prefer to refuse power rather than to use it, the supply of men who prefer ruling to submitting is so great that it is hard to imagine the time when it shall be exhausted. For this process of the Christianization of all men to take place, for all men one after another to pass over from the pagan concept of life to the Christian, and voluntarily renounce power and wealth, and for no one to desire to make use of them, it is necessary that not only all those rude, semi-savage men, who are entirely incapable of adopting Christianity and following it, and of whom there are always such a great number amidst every Christian society, but also all savage and non-Christian nations in general, of whom there are so many outside the Christian society, should be made Christian. And so, even if we admit that the process of Christianization will someday be accomplished in the case of all men, we must assume, judging from how much the matter has advanced in 1800 years, that this will happen in several times 1800 years. And so it is impossible and useless to think now of the impossible abolition of power, and all we should think of is that the power should be vested in the best of hands. Thus retort the defenders of the existing order. And this reflection would be quite correct if the transition of men from one concept of life to another took place only by force of the one process, where every man learns individually and one after another by experience the vanity of power, and by an inner way reaches the Christian truths. This process takes place without cessation, and by this way men one after another pass over to the side of Christianity. But men pass over to the side of Christianity not by this inner path alone. There is also an external method with which the gradualness of this transition is destroyed. The transition of men from one structure of life to another does not always take place in the manner in which the sand is poured out from an hourglass, one kernel of sand after another, from the first to the last, but rather like water pouring into a vessel that is immerged in the water, when it at first admits the water evenly and slowly at one side, and then, from the weight of the water already taken in, suddenly dips down fast and almost all at once receives all the water which it can hold. The same occurs with societies of men at the transition from one concept, and so from one structure of life to another. It is only at first that one after another slowly and gradually receives the new truth by an inner way and follows it through life, but after a certain diffusion it is no longer received in an internal manner, nor gradually, but all at once, almost involuntarily. And so there is no truth in the reflection of the defenders of the existing order that, if in the course of 1800 years only a small part of mankind has passed over to the side of Christianity, it will take several times 1800 years before the rest of humanity will pass over to its side. There is no truth in it, because with this reflection no attention is paid to any other than the internal attainment of the truth, and the transition from one form of life to another. This other method of attaining a newly revealed truth and transition to a new structure of life consists in this, that men do not attain the truth simply because they perceive it with a prophetic feeling or experience of life, but also because at a certain stage of the dissemination of the truth, all men who stand on a lower stage of development accept it all at once, out of confidence in those who have accepted it in an internal way and apply it to life. Every new truth, which changes the composition of human life and moves humanity forward, is at first accepted by only a very small number of men who understand it in an internal way. The rest, who out of confidence had accepted the previous truth, on which the existing order is based, always oppose the dissemination of the new truth. But since, in the first place, men do not stand still, but incessantly move forward, comprehending the truth more and approaching it with their lives, and, in the second place, all of them, through their age, education, and race, are predisposed to a gradation of men, from those who are most capable to comprehend newly revealed truths in an internal way to those who are least capable to do so, the men who stand nearest to those who have attained the truth in an internal way one after another, at first after long periods of time, and then more and more frequently, pass over to the side of the new truth, and the number of men who recognize the new truth grows larger and larger, and the truth grows all the time more and more comprehensible. The greater the number of men who attain the truth and the more the truth is comprehensible, the more confidence is evoked in the rest of the men, who in their ability to comprehend stand on a lower stage. And the easier does the attainment of the truth grow for them, and the greater is the number who make the truth their own. Thus the movement keeps accelerating and accelerating, expanding and expanding like a snowball, until there germinates a public opinion which is in accord with the new truth, and the remaining mass of men no longer singly, but in a body, under the pressure of this force, passes over to the side of the new truth, and a new structure of life is established, which is in agreement with this truth. Men who pass over to the side of a new truth which has reached a certain degree of dissemination always do so all at once, in a mass, and they are like that ballast with which every vessel is laden all at once for its stable equilibrium and regular course. If there were no ballast, the vessel would not stay in the water and would be changing its course with the least change in conditions. This ballast, though at first it seems to be superfluous and even to retard the ship's motion, is a necessary condition of its regular motion. The same is true of that mass of men who, not one by one, but always all together, under the influence of a new public opinion, pass over from one concept of life to another. By its inertia, this mass always retards the rapid, frequent transitions, unverified by human wisdom, from one structure of life to another, and for a long time retains every truth which, verified by a long experience of a struggle, has entered into the consciousness of humanity. And so there is no truth in the reflection that, if only a very small, part of humanity has attained the Christian truth in the course of 18 centuries, the whole of humanity will attain it only in many, many times 1800 years, that it is so far away that we of the present time need not even think of it. It is untrue, because the men who stand on a lower stage of development, those very nations and people whom the defenders of the existing order represent as a hindrance for the realization of the Christian structure of life, are the same people who always at once, in a mass, pass over to the side of a truth which is accepted by public opinion. Therefore, the change in the life of humanity, the one in consequence of which men in power will renounce the power, and among the men who submit to power there will not be found such as are desirous of seizing it, will not arrive when all men one after another to the very last shall have consciously attained the Christian life conception, but when there arises a definite, easily comprehensible Christian public opinion which will conquer all that inert mass that is unable by an internal way to attain the truths and so is always subject to the effect of public opinion. But public opinion to arise and be diffused does not need hundreds and thousands of years, and has the property of acting infectiously upon people and with great rapidity embracing large numbers of men. But if it is even true, the defenders of the existing order will say that public opinion, at a certain stage of its definiteness and lucidity, is able to make the inert mass of men outside the Christian societies, the non-Christian nations, and corrupt and coarse men who live within the societies submit to it. What are the symptoms that this Christian public opinion has arisen and may take the place of violence? It is not right for us to take the risk and reject violence, by which the existing order is maintained, and to depend on the impalpable and indefinite force of public opinion, leaving it to the savage men outside and inside the societies with impunity to rob, kill, and in every way violate the Christians. If with the aid of the power we with difficulty eddy away from the non-Christian elements, which are ever ready to inundate us and destroy all the progress of the Christian civilization, is there, in the first place, a probability that public opinion can take the part of this force and make us secure, and, in the second, how are we to find that moment when public opinion has become so strong that it can take the place of the power? To remove the power and to depend for our self-defense on nothing but public opinion means to act as senselessly as would a man who in a menagerie would throw away his weapons and let out all the lions and tigers from their cages, depending on the fact that the animals in the cages and in the presence of heated rods appeared tame. And so the men who have the power, who by fate or by God are placed in the position of the ruling, have no right to risk the ruin of all the progress of civilization, only because they would like to make an experiment as to whether public opinion can take the place of the protection of power, and so must not give up their power. The French writer, Alphonse Karr, now forgotten, has said somewhere, when speaking of the impossibility of abolishing capital punishment, que messers les assassins commencent par nous donner l'exemple. 30 and many times after that have I heard the repetition of this joke by men who thought that with these words they gave a conclusive and clever argument against the abolition of capital punishment. And yet it is impossible more lucidly to express all that falseness of the argument of those who think that the governments cannot give up their power so long as men are capable of it, than by this very joke. Let the assassins, say the defenders of the violence of state, set us the example by abolishing murder, and then we shall abolish it. But the assassins say the same, only with greater right. The assassins say, let those who have undertaken to teach and guide us set us the example of abolishing murder, and then we will follow them. And they do not say so for a joke, but in all seriousness, because such indeed is the state of affairs. We cannot desist from violence, because we are on all sides surrounded by violators. Nothing in our day interferes more than this false consideration with the forward motion of humanity and the establishment among it of that structure of life which is already proper for its present consciousness. The men in power are convinced that it is only violence that moves and guides men, and so they boldly use violence for the maintenance of the present order of things. But the existing order is not maintained through violence, but through public opinion, the effect of which is impaired by violence. Thus, the activity of violence weakens and impairs precisely what it intends to maintain. Violence, in the best case, if it does not pursue only the personal ends of men in power, always denies and condemns by the one immovable form of the law what for the most part has been denied and condemned before by public opinion. But with this difference, that, while public opinion denies and condemns all acts which are contrary to the moral law, embracing in its condemnation the most varied propositions, the law which is supported by violence condemns and persecutes only a certain, very narrow order of acts, thus, as it were, justifying all the acts of the same order which have not entered into its definition. Public opinion has ever since the time of Moses considered avarice, debauchery, and cruelty to be evil, and has condemned them, and this public opinion denies and condemns every kind of a manifestation of avarice. Not only the acquisition of another man's property by means of violence, deceit, and cunning, but also a cruel usufruct of the same. It condemns every kind of debauchery, be it fornication with a concubine or a slave, a divorced wife, or even one's own wife. It condemns every cruelty. which is expressed in assaults, in bad treatment, in the murder, not only of men, but also of animals. But the law, which is based on violence, prosecutes only certain forms of avarice, such as theft, rascality, and certain forms of debauchery and cruelty, such as the violation of marital fidelity, murders, crippling, therefore, as it were, permitting all those phases of avarice, debauchery, and cruelty which do not fit in with the narrow definition, which is subject to misinterpretations. But not only does violence distort public opinion, it also produces in men that pernicious conviction that men are not moved by spiritual force, which is the source of every forward movement of humanity, but by violence. That very action which not only does not bring people nearer to truth, but always removes them from it. This delusion is pernicious in that it compels men to neglect the fundamental force of their life, their spiritual activity, and to transfer all their attention and energy to the superficial, idle, and for the most part harmful activity of violence. This delusion is like the one men would be in if they wished to make a locomotive move by turning its wheels with their hands, forgetting entirely that the prime cause of its motion is the expansion of steam and not the motion of the wheels. Men who would turn the wheels with their hands and with levers would produce nothing but a semblance of motion, in the meantime bending the wheels and interfering with the possibility of the locomotive's real motion. It is this that men do when they want to move men by means of external violence. Men say that a Christian life without violence cannot be established because there are savage nations outside of Christian society, in Africa, in Asia. Some people represent the Chinese as such a peril for our civilization, and there are such savage, corrupt, and, according to the new theory of heredity, confirmed criminals amidst Christian societies, and that violence is needed for the purpose of keeping either from destroying our civilization. But those savage men, outside and within the societies with whom we frighten ourselves and others, have never submitted to violence and are not even now conquered by it. Nations have never subjugated other nations by violence alone. If a nation which subjugated another stood on a lower stage of development, there was always repeated the phenomenon that it did not introduce its structure of life by means of violence, but, on the contrary, always submitted to the structure of life which existed in the conquered nation. If a nation, crushed by force, is subjugated or close to subjugation, it is so only through public opinion, and by no means through violence, which, on the contrary, provokes the nation more and more. If men have ever been subjugated by whole nations to a new religious confession, and by whole nations have been baptized or have passed over to Mohammedanism, these transformations did not take place because men in power compelled them to do so. Violence has, on the contrary, more frequently encouraged the movements in the opposite direction, but because public opinion compelled them to do so. But the nations that were compelled by force to accept the faiths of their conquerors have never accepted them. The same is true in respect to those savage elements which exist within the societies. It is not the increase nor the decrease of the severity of punishments, nor the change of prisons, nor the increase of the police that diminish or increase the number of crimes. It is changed only in consequence of the change in public opinion. No severities have eradicated duels and vendettas in some countries. No matter how much the Circassians may be punished for theft, they continue to steal out of bravado, because not one maiden will marry a man who has not shown his daring by stealing a horse or at least a sheep. If men shall stop fighting duels and Circassians shall stop stealing, this will not be so because they are afraid of punishment. The fear of being punished only increases the charm of the daring, but because public opinion will be changed. The same is true in all other crimes. Violence can never destroy what is accepted by public opinion. On the contrary, public opinion need only be diametrically opposed to violence to destroy its every action, as has always been the case with every martyrdom. We do not know what would happen if no violence were exerted against hostile nations and criminal elements of society. But that the employment of violence at the present time does not subjugate either of them, that we know from protracted experience. Indeed, how can we subjugate by force the nations whose whole education, all whose traditions, even religious teaching, leads them to see the highest virtue in a struggle with their enslavers and in striving after liberty? And how are we forcibly to eradicate crimes in the midst of our societies when what by the governments are considered to be crimes are considered to be virtues by public opinion? It is possible by means of violence to destroy such nations and such men, as is indeed done, but it is impossible to subjugate them. The judge of everything, the fundamental force which moves men and nations, has always been the one invisible, impalpable force, the resultant of all the spiritual forces of a certain aggregate of men and of all humanity, which is expressed in public opinion. Violence only weakens this force, retards and distorts it, and puts in its place another activity, which is not only not useful, but even harmful for the forward movement of humanity. To subjugate to Christianity all the wild people outside the Christian world, all the Zulus, Manchurians, and Chinese, whom many consider to be wild, and the savages within the Christian world, there is only one means: the dissemination among these nations of a Christian public opinion, which is established only through a Christian life, Christian acts, Christian examples. And so, in order to conquer the nations which have remained unconquered by Christianity, the men of our time, who possess one and only one means for this purpose, do precisely the opposite of what might attain their end. To conquer to Christianity the wild nations, who do not touch us and who do not in any way provoke us to oppress them, we, instead of leaving them first of all alone, and, in case of necessity or of a wish to get in closer relations with them, acting upon them only through a Christian relation to them, through the Christian teaching as proved by truly Christian acts of suffering, humility, abstinence, purity, brotherhood, love, begin by this, that we open among them new markets for our commerce. With nothing but our advantage in view, seize their land, that is, rob them, sell them wine, tobacco, opium, that is, corrupt them, and establish among them our order, teach them violence and all its methods, that is, the following of nothing but the animal law of struggle, below which no man can descend, and we do everything which can be done in order to conceal from them whatever of Christianity there is in us. And after that we send to them about 24 missionaries, who prattle some hypocritical ecclesiastic absurdities, and, in the shape of incontrovertible proofs of the impossibility of applying the Christian truths to life, adduce these our experiments at the Christianization of the savages. The same is true of the so-called criminals who live within our societies. To subjugate these men to Christianity, there is but one, the only way, the Christian public opinion, which can be established among these men only by means of the true Christian teaching, confirmed by a true Christian example of life. And so, to preach this Christian teaching and confirm it by a Christian example, we establish among these people agonizing prisons, guillotines, gallows, capital punishments, preparations for murder, for which we use all our strength. We establish for the common people idolatrous doctrines, which are to stupefy them. We establish the governmental sale of intoxicants, wine, tobacco, opium. We establish even prostitution. We give the land to those who do not need it. We establish spectacles of senseless luxury amidst wretchedness. We destroy every possibility of every semblance of a Christian public opinion. We cautiously destroy the established Christian public opinion, and then we quote these very men, who have carefully been corrupted by ourselves, and whom we lock up, like wild beasts, in places from which they cannot get away, and in which they grow more bestial still, or whom we kill, as examples of the impossibility of acting upon them otherwise than through violence. What takes place is like what happens when conscientious ignorant physicians place a patient who has been cured by the force of nature under most unhygienic conditions and stuff him full of poisonous medicines, and then claim that it was only thanks to their hygiene and care that the patient did not die, whereas the sick man would have been well long ago if they had left him alone. Violence, which is put forth as the instrument for maintaining the Christian structure of life, not only does not produce this effect, but, on the contrary, prevents this social structure from being what it could and should be. The social structure is such as it is, not thanks to violence, but in spite of it. And so there is no truth in the assertion of the defenders of the existing order that, if violence barely keeps the evil non-Christian elements of humanity from attacking us, The abolition of violence and the substitution of public opinion for it will not protect humanity. It is not true, because violence does not protect humanity, but, on the contrary, deprives humanity of the one possibility of a true protection through the establishment and diffusion of the Christian public opinion as regards the existing order of life. Only with the abolition of violence will Christian public opinion cease to be corrupt and receive the possibility of an unimpeded diffusion, and men will not direct their strength toward what they do not need, but toward the one spiritual force which moves them. But how can we reject the visible, palpable protection of the policeman with his revolver and depend on something invisible, impalpable, the public opinion? Does it still exist or not? Above all else, we know the order of things in which we live. Be it good or bad, we know its defects and are used to it. We know how to act, what to do under present conditions, but what will happen when we reject them and depend on something invisible, impalpable, and entirely unknown? And the uncertainty upon which men enter when rejecting the known order of things seems terrible to them. It is all very well to be afraid of the uncertainty when our position is firm and secure, but our position is not only not secure, we know for certain that we are standing on the brink of perdition. If we have to be afraid of something, let us be afraid of what is really terrible and not of what we only imagine to be terrible. In our fear to make an effort to tear ourselves away from the conditions which ruin us, only because the future is not quite certain to us, we resemble the passengers of a sinking ship who, for fear of stepping into a boat which is to take them to the shore, retreat to their cabins and refuse to come out from them, or those sheep which, out of fear of the fire which has enveloped the whole yard, press close under the penthouses and do not walk through the open gates. How can we, who are standing on the threshold of a war of inner revolutions, which is terrifying by its wretchedness and destructiveness, and in comparison with which, as those who are preparing it say, the terrors of the year 93 will be play, speak of a danger which is threatened us by the Dahamians, the Zulus, etc., who live far, far away and do not think of attacking us, and by those few thousands of robbers, thieves, and murderers whom we ourselves have stupefied and corrupted, and whose number is not at all diminishing as the result of all our courts, prisons, and capital punishments? Besides, this fear of the abolition of the visible protection of the policeman is preeminently a fear of city people, that is, of people who live under abnormal and artificial conditions. Men who live under normal conditions of life, not amidst cities, but amidst nature, struggling with it, live without this protection and know how little violence can protect them against the actual dangers with which they are surrounded. In this fear there is something morbid, which depends mainly on those false conditions under which many of us live and have grown up. An alienist told me how one summer day he was accompanied by his insane patients as far as the gate of the hospital which he was leaving. "Come with me to the city," the doctor proposed to them. The patients agreed to it, and a small crowd followed the doctor. But the farther they proceeded along the street, where took place the free motion of sound men, the more did they feel timid, and the more did they press close to the doctor, retarding his walk. Finally, they all began to ask him to take them back to the hospital, to their senseless, but habitual mode of life, to their guards, their blows, their long sleeves, their solitary cells. Even thus men press close and hanker after their senseless structure of life, their factories, courts, prisons, capital punishments, wars, though Christianity calls them to freedom, to the free, rational life of the future, the imminent age. Men say, "By what shall we be made secure when the existing order is destroyed? What will the new orders be which will take the place of those of the present time, and in what will they consist?" So long as we do not know how our life will be composed, we shall not move on or budge from our place. This demand is what the explorer of new countries might put forth in demanding a detailed description of the country into which he is entering. If the life of the individual man, in passing from one age to another, were fully known to him, he would have no reason for living. The same is true of the life of humanity. If it had a program of the life which awaits it as it enters upon its new age, this would be the surest symptom that it is not living, does not move on, but is whirling about in one spot. The conditions of the new structure of life cannot be known to us because they have to be worked out by ourselves. In this alone does life consist, namely, in recognizing the unknown and conforming our activity to this new cognition. In this does the life of every individual and the life of human societies and of humanity consist. Chapter 11. The condition of Christian humanity, with its prisons, hard labor, gallows, with its factories, accumulations of capital, with its taxes, churches, saloons, houses of ill fame, ever-growing armaments, and millions of stupefied men, who are ready, like chained dogs, to thrust themselves upon those the masters may set them on, would be terrible if it were the product of violence, whereas it is above all the product of public opinion. But what is established by public opinion not only can be, but actually is, destroyed by it. Hundreds of millions in money, tens of millions of disciplined men, implements of destruction of wonderful power, with an organization which of late has been carried to the highest degree of perfection, with a whole army of men whose calling it is to deceive and hypnotize the masses, and all this, by means of electricity, which annihilates space, subjected to men who not only consider such a structure of society to be advantageous for them, but even such that without it they would inevitably perish, and who, therefore, use every effort of their minds in order to maintain it. What an invincible force, one would think. And yet, one needs but get a conception of what it all tends to and what no one can keep back, that among men there will be established a Christian public opinion with the same force and universality as the pagan public opinion, and that it will take the place of the pagan one, that the majority of men will be just as ashamed of all participation in violence and its exploitation as men are now ashamed of rascality, stealing, beggary, cowardice. And immediately this complex and apparently powerful structure of life falls of its own accord, without any struggle. It is not necessary for anything new to enter into the consciousness of men, but only for the mist to disappear, which conceals from men the true meaning of some acts of violence. In order that this may happen and the growing Christian public opinion should get the better of the obsolescent pagan public opinion, which admitted and justified acts of violence, all that is needed is that men should feel as much ashamed of doing acts of violence, of taking part in them, and exploiting them, as it is now a disgrace to pass for a rascal, a thief, a coward, a beggar. And it is precisely this that is beginning to happen. We do not notice it, just as men do not notice any motion when they move together with everything surrounding them. It is true. The structure of life in its main features remains as violent in nature as it was 100 years ago, and not only the same, but in some relations, especially in the preparations for war and in the wars themselves. It appears to be even more cruel, but the germinating Christian public opinion, which at a certain stage of its development is to change the whole pagan structure of life, is beginning to be active. The dried-up tree stands apparently as firm as before. It even looks firmer because it is rougher, but it is already weakened at the pith and is getting ready to fall. The same is true of the present structure of life, which is based on violence. The external condition of men is the same. Some are the violators, as before, and others are the violated, but the view of the violators and the violated upon the meaning and worth of the position of either has changed. The violating people, that is, those who take part in the government, and those who make use of the violence, that is, the rich, no longer represent, as formerly, the flower of society and the ideal of human well-being and grandeur, toward which all the violated used to strive. Now very frequently it is not so much the violated who strive after the position of the violators and try to imitate them, as the violators, who frequently of their own free will renounce the advantages of their position, choose the condition of the violated, and try in simplicity of life to emulate the violated. To say nothing of the now openly despised occupations and offices, such as those of spies, agents of secret police, usurers, saloon keepers, a large number of occupations of violators, which formerly used to be considered respectable, such as those of policemen, courtiers, members of courts, the administration, the clergy, the military, monopolists, bankers, not only are not considered by all to be desirable, but are even condemned by a certain most respectable circle of men. There are now men who voluntarily renounce these positions, which heretofore were considered to be above reproach, and who prefer less advantageous positions, which are not connected with violence. It is not only men of the state, but also rich men who, not from a religious feeling, as used to be the case, but only from a peculiar sensitiveness for the germinating public opinion, refuse to receive their inherited fortunes, considering it just use only so much as they earn by their own labor. The conditions of the participant in the government and of the rich man no longer present themselves as they presented themselves formerly and even now present themselves among the non-Christian nations, as unquestionably honorable and worthy of respect and as divine blessings. Very sensitive, moral men, they are for the most part the most highly cultured, avoid these conditions and prefer more modest ones, which are independent of violence. The best young men, at an age when they are not yet corrupted by life and when they choose a career, prefer the activities of physicians, technologists, teachers, artists, writers, even simply of agriculturists who live by their own labor, to positions in courts, in the administration, in the church, and in the army, which are paid by the government, or the positions of men who live on their own incomes. The majority of monuments which are now erected are no longer in commemoration of men of state, of generals, and less certainly not of the rich, but of the learned, of artists, of inventors, of men who have not only had nothing in common with the governments or with the authorities, but who frequently have struggled against them. It is not so much men of state and rich men as learned men and artists who are extolled in poetry, represented in plastic art, and honored with festive jubilees. The best men of our time tend toward these most honored positions, and so the circle from which the men of state and the rich come is growing smaller and smaller, so that in intellect, culture, and especially in moral qualities, the men who now stand at the head of governments and the rich no longer represent, as in olden times, the flower of society, but, on the contrary, stand below the average. As in Russia and in Turkey, so in America and in France, no matter how much the governments may change their officials, the majority of them are selfish and venal men, who stand on so low a level of morality that they do not satisfy even those low demands of simple integrity which the governments make upon them. We now frequently get to hear the naive regrets of men of state, because the best men, by some strange accident, as they think, are always in the hostile camp. It is as though men should complain that by a strange accident it is always men with little refinement, who are not particularly good, that become hangmen. The majority of rich men, similarly, in our time are no longer composed of the most refined and cultured men of society, as used to be the case, but of coarse accumulators of wealth, who are interested only in their enrichment, for the most part by dishonest means, or of degenerating descendants of these accumulators, who not only do not play any prominent part in society, but in the majority of cases are subject to universal contempt. Not only is the circle of men, from which the servants of the government and the rich men are chosen, growing all the time smaller and smaller and more debased, but these men themselves no longer ascribe to the positions which they hold their former significance, and frequently, being ashamed of them, to the disadvantage of the cause which they serve, neglect to carry out what by their position they are called upon to do. Kings and emperors have the management of hardly anything, hardly ever have the courage to make internal changes and to enter into new external political conditions, but for the most part leave the solution of these questions to state institutions or to public opinion. All their duties reduce themselves to being the representatives of state unity and supremacy. But even this duty they are performing worse and worse. The majority of them not only do not keep themselves in their former inaccessible grandeur, but, on the contrary, are becoming more and more democratized, and even keep low company, throwing off their last external prestige, that is, violating precisely what they are called upon to maintain. The same takes place among the military. The military men of the higher ranks, instead of encouraging the coarseness and cruelty of the soldiers, which are necessary for their business, themselves disseminate culture among the military, preach humanitarianism, and frequently themselves share the socialistic convictions of the masses and reject war. In the late plots against the Russian government, Many of those mixed up with them were army men. The number of these military plotters is growing larger and larger. Very frequently it happens, as was the case lately, that the soldiers who are called upon to pacify the inhabitants refuse to shoot at them. Military bravado is directly condemned by army men themselves and frequently serves as a subject for ridicule. The same is true of judges and prosecuting attorneys. Judges, whose duty it is to judge and sentence criminals, manage the proceedings in such a way as to discharge them, so that the Russian government, to have men sentenced that it wants to have sentenced, never subjects them to common courts, but turns them over to so-called military courts, which represent but a semblance of courts. The same is true of prosecuting attorneys, who frequently refuse to prosecute and, instead of prosecuting, circumvent the law, defending those whom they should prosecute. Learned jurists, who are obliged to justify the violence of power, more and more deny the right to punish, and in its place introduce theories of irresponsibility, and even not of the correction, but of the cure of those whom they call criminals. Jailers and superintendents of hard labor convicts, for the most part, become defenders of those whom they are supposed to torture. Gendarmes and spies constantly save those whom they are supposed to ruin. Clerical persons preach toleration, often also the negation of violence, and the more cultured among them try in their sermons to avoid the lie which forms the whole meaning of their position and which they are called upon to preach. Executioners refuse to carry out their duties, so that in Russia capital punishment can frequently not be carried out for want of executioners, since, in spite of the advantages held out to make hard labor convicts become executioners, there is an ever-decreasing number of such as are willing to take up the duty. Governors, rural judges and officers, collectors of taxes, publicans, pitying the people, frequently try to find excuses for not collecting the taxes from them. Rich men cannot make up their minds to use their wealth for themselves alone, but distribute it for public purposes. Landowners erect on their lands hospitals and schools, and some of them even renounce the ownership of land and transfer it to the agriculturists, or establish communes on it. Manufacturers build hospitals, schools, houses for their workmen, and establish savings banks and pensions. Some establish companies in which they take an equal share with other shareholders. Capitalists give part of their capital for public, educational, artistic, philanthropic institutions. Unable to part from their wealth during their lifetime, many of them will it away after their death in favor of public institutions. All these phenomena might appear accidental if they did not all reduce themselves to one common cause, just as it might seem accidental that the buds should swell on some of the trees in spring if we did not know that the cause of it is the common spring, and that, if the buds have begun to swell on some of the trees, the same no doubt will happen with all of the trees. The same is true in the manifestation of the Christian public opinion as regards the significance of violence and of what is based upon it. If this public opinion is already influencing some very sensitive men and causes them, each in his own business, to renounce the privileges which violence grants, or not to use them, it will continue to act on others, and will act until it will change the whole activity of men and will bring them in agreement with that Christian consciousness which is already living among the leading men of humanity. And if there now are rulers who do not have the courage to undertake anything in the name of their own power, and who try as much as possible to resemble, not monarchs, but the simplest mortals, and who show their readiness to renounce their prerogatives and to become the first citizens of their republics, and if there are now army men who understand all the evil and sinfulness of war and do not wish to shoot at men belonging to another nation or to their own, and judges and prosecuting attorneys who do not wish to prosecute and condemn criminals, and clergymen who renounce their lie, and publicans who try as little as possible to perform what they are called upon to perform, and rich men who give up their wealth. The same will inevitably happen with other governments, other army men, other members of the court, clergymen, publicans, and rich men. And when there shall be no men to hold these positions, there will be none of these positions and no violence. But it is not by this road alone that public opinion leads men to the abolition of the existing order and the substitution of another for it. In proportion as the positions of violence become less and less attractive, and there are fewer and fewer men willing to occupy them, their uselessness becomes more and more apparent. In the Christian world, there are the same rulers and governments, the same courts, the same publicans, the same clergy, the same rich men, landowners, manufacturers, and capitalists as before. But there is an entirely different relation of men toward men and of the men themselves toward their positions. It is still the same rulers, the same meetings and chases and feasts and balls and uniforms and the same diplomats and talks about alliances and wars, the same parliaments, in which they still discuss Eastern and African questions and alliances, and breaches of relations and home rule and an 8-hour day. And the ministries give way to one another in the same way, and there are the same speeches, the same incidents. But men who see how one article in a newspaper changes the state of affairs more than dozens of meetings of monarchs and sessions of parliaments see more and more clearly that it is not the meetings and rendezvous and the discussions in the parliaments that guide the affairs of men, but something independent of all this, which is not centered anywhere. There are the same generals and officers and soldiers and guns and fortresses and parades and maneuvers, but there has been no war for a year, 10, 20 years, and, besides, one can depend less on the military for the suppression of riots. And it is getting clearer and clearer that, therefore, generals and officers and soldiers are only members of festive processions, objects of amusement for rulers, large, rather expensive corps de ballet. There are the same prosecutors and judges and the same proceedings, but it is getting clearer and clearer that, since civil cases are decided on the basis of all kinds of considerations except that of justice, and since criminal cases have no sense, because punishments attain no purpose admitted even by the judges, these institutions have no other significance than that of serving as a means for supporting men who are not fit for anything more useful. There are the same clergymen and bishops and churches and synods, but it is becoming clearer and clearer to all men that these men have long ago ceased to believe in what they preach, and that, therefore, they cannot convince anyone of the necessity of believing in what they themselves do not believe. There are the same collectors of taxes, but they are becoming less and less capable of taking away by force people's property. And it is becoming clearer and clearer that people can, without collectors of taxes, collect all that is necessary by subscribing it voluntarily. There are the same rich men, but it is becoming clearer and clearer that they can be useful only in proportion as they cease to be personal managers of their wealth and give to society all, or at least a part, of their fortunes. When all this shall become completely clear to all, it will be natural for men to ask themselves, but why should we feed and maintain all these kings, emperors, presidents, and members of all kinds of chambers and ministries? If nothing results from all their meetings and discussions, would it not be better, as some jester said, to make a queen out of rubber? And what good to us are the armies, with their generals and music and cavalry and drums? What good are they when there is no war and no one wants to conquer anyone, and when, even if there is a war, the other nations do not let us profit from it, and the troops refuse to shoot at their own people? And what good are judges and prosecutors who in civil cases do not decide according to justice and in criminal cases know themselves that all punishments are useless? And of what use are collectors of taxes who unwillingly collect the taxes, while what is needed is collected without them? And of what use is the clergy, which has long ago ceased to believe in what it preaches? And of what use is capital in private hands, when it can be of use only by becoming the common possession? And having once asked themselves this, people cannot help but come to the conclusion that they ought not to support all these useless institutions. But not only will the men who support these institutions arrive at the necessity of abolishing them, the men themselves who occupy these positions will simultaneously, or even earlier, be brought to the necessity of giving up their positions. Public opinion more and more condemns violence, and so men, more and more submitting to public opinion, are less and less desirous of holding their positions, which are maintained by violence, and those who hold these positions are less and less able to make use of violence. But by not using violence and yet remaining in positions which are conditioned by violence, the men who occupy these positions become more and more useless. And this uselessness, which is more and more felt by those who maintain these positions and by those who hold them, will finally be such that there will be found no men to maintain them and none who would be willing to hold them. Once I was present in Moscow at some discussions about faith, which, as usual, took place during Quasimodo week near a church in Okhotny Ryad. About 20 men were gathered on the sidewalk, and a serious discussion on religion was going on. At the same time, there was some kind of a concert in the adjoining building of the Assembly of Noblemen, and an officer of police, noticing a crowd of people gathered near the church, sent a mounted gendarme to order them to disperse. The officer had personally no desire that they should disperse. The crowd of 20 men were in nobody's way, but the officer had been standing there the whole morning, and he had to do something. The gendarme, a young lad, with his right arm jauntily akimbo and clattering sword, rode up to us and shouted commandingly, "Scatter." "What are you doing there?" Everybody looked at the gendarme, and one of the speakers, a modest man in a long coat, said calmly and kindly, "We are talking about something important, and there is no reason why we should scatter. Young man, you had better get down and listen to what we are talking about. It will do you good," and turning away, he continued his discourse. The gendarme made no reply, wheeled his horse around, and rode off. The same thing must happen in all matters of violence. The officer feels ennui. He has nothing to do. The poor fellow is placed in a position where he must command. He is deprived of all human life, and all he can do is to look and command, to command and look, though his commands and his watching are of no earthly use. In such a condition, all those unfortunate rulers, ministers, members of parliaments, governors, generals, officers, bishops, clergymen, even rich men are now partly and soon will be completely. They can do nothing else but command, and they command and send their messengers, as the officer sends his gendarme, to be in people's way, and since the people whom they trouble turn to them with the request that they be left alone, they imagine that they are indispensable. But the time is coming and will soon be here, when it shall be quite clear for all men that they are not any good and are only in the way of people, and the people whom they bother will say to them kindly and meekly, as that man in the long overcoat, "Please, do not bother us." And all the messengers and senders will have to follow that good advice, that is, stop riding with arms akimbo among the people, bothering them, and get down from their hobbies, take off their attire, listen to what people have to say, and, joining them, take hold with them of the true human work. The time is coming and will inevitably come when all the institutions of violence of our time will be destroyed in consequence of their too obvious uselessness, silliness, and even indecency. The time must come when with the men of our world, who hold positions that are given by violence, will happen what happened with the king in Andersen's fable, The Emperor's New Clothes, when a small child, seeing the naked king, naively called out, "Behold, he is naked." And all those who had seen it before, but had not expressed it, could no longer conceal it. The point of the fable is this, that to the king, a lover of new garments, there come some tailors who promise to make him an extraordinary garment. The king hires the tailors, and they begin to sew, having informed him that the peculiarity of their garment is this, that he who is useless in his office cannot see the garments. The courtiers come to see the work of the tailors, but they see nothing, as the tailors stick their needles into empty space. But, mindful of the condition, all the courtiers say that they see the garment, and they praise it. The king does the same. The time arrives for the procession, when the king is to appear in his new garment. The king undresses himself and puts on his new garments, that is, he remains naked and goes naked through the city. But, mindful of the condition, no one dares to say that there are no garments until a small child calls out, "Behold, he is naked." The same thing must happen with all those who from inertia hold offices which have long ago become useless, when the first man who is not interested, as the proverb has it, one hand washes the other, in concealing the uselessness of these institutions, will point out their uselessness and will naively call out, "But, good people, they have long ago ceased to be good for anything." The condition of Christian humanity, with its fortresses, guns, dynamite, cannon, torpedoes, prisons, gallows, churches, factories, custom houses, palaces, is indeed terrible, but neither fortresses nor cannon, nor guns shoot themselves at anyone. Prisons do not themselves lock anyone up. The gallows does not hang anyone. The churches do not of themselves deceive anyone. The custom houses hold no one back. Palaces and factories do not erect and maintain themselves. But everything is done by men. But when men understand that this ought not to be done, there will be none of these things. Men are already beginning to understand this. If not all men understand it as yet, the leaders among men do, those after whom follow all other men. And what the leaders have once come to understand, they can never stop understanding, and what the leaders have come to understand, all other men not only can, but inevitably must understand. Thus the prediction that the time will come when all men shall be instructed by God, shall stop warring, shall forge the swords into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks, that is, translating into our language, when all the prisons, fortresses, barracks, palaces, churches shall remain empty, and all the gallows, guns, cannon shall remain unused, is no longer a dream, but a definite new form of life, toward which humanity is moving with ever-increasing rapidity. But when shall this be? 1800 years ago, Christ answered this question by saying that the end of the present world, that is, of the pagan structure of the world, would come when the calamities of men should be increased to their farthest limit, and at the same time the gospel of the kingdom of God, that is, the possibility of a new, violenceless structure of the world, should be preached in all the world. Matthew 24 verse 3, 28. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, but my Father only. Matthew 24 verse 36 is what Christ says, for it may come any time, at any moment, even when we do not expect it. In reply to the question when this hour shall arrive, Christ says that we cannot know it, but for the very reason that we do not know the time of its coming, we should not only be at all times prepared to meet it, as must be the goodman watching the house, and the virgins with their lamps going forth to meet the bridegroom, but also we should work with all our strength for the coming of that hour, as the servants had to work for the talents given to them. Matthew 24 verse 43, 25:1. 30. In reply to the question when this hour should come, Christ admonished all men to work with all their strength for its quicker coming. There can be no other answer. People can nowise know when the day and the hour of the kingdom of God shall arrive, because the coming of that hour depends on no one but the men themselves. The answer is the same as that of the sage, who in reply to the question of a passer-by, how far it was to the city, answered, "Go." How can we know how far it is to the goal toward which humanity is moving, since we do not know how humanity, on whom it depends whether to go or not, to stop, to temper the motion, or to accelerate it, will move toward that goal? All we can know is what we, who compose humanity, must do, and what not, in order that the kingdom of God may come. That we all know. And everyone need but begin to do what we must do, and stop doing what we must not do. Every one of us need only live by all that light which is within us, in order that the promised kingdom of God, toward which the heart of every man is drawn, may come at once.